Tonight, we're uncovering the complete dark history of the wizarding world. This is a fascinating topic, but I'll keep my narration calm to ensure you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Long before a boy with a lightning-shaped scar ever walked the stone corridors of Hogwarts, and centuries before the name Lord Voldemort was whispered in terrified breaths, the foundations of the magical world were already stained with a shadow that never truly receded. We often think of dark magic as a modern infection, a deviation brought about by a few exceptionally cruel men in the 20th century. But the truth buried in the restricted sections and the ancient scrolls is far more unsettling. Dark magic is not a mere branch of magical study. It is an ancient, sentient-like force that has evolved alongside civilization itself, twisting the very fabric of magical law and human morality since the dawn of recorded history. To understand the darkness of the Harry Potter universe, we have to look past the flashy duels and the green light of the killing curse. We have to look into the abyss of the human soul and the lengths to which certain witches and wizards have gone to cheat death, command the weak, and rewrite the laws of nature. Imagine a world where there were no regulations, no Ministry of Magic to monitor spellwork, and no international statute of secrecy to hide the supernatural from the mundane. In these ancient times, the line between a healer and a bringer of death was razor thin. We begin journey in the dusty heat of ancient Greece, where a man named Herpo the Fool first looked at the natural order and decided it was not enough. He didn't just want power, he wanted to conquer the one thing every living being fears, the end. By hatching the first basilisk and, more importantly, by becoming the first person to ever successfully splinter his own soul to create a just commit a crime, he altered the magical blueprints of reality. He proved that the soul could be mangled for the sake of ego, and that acts of primordial evil sent ripples through time that would eventually find their way into the hands of Tom Riddle thousands of years later. But dark history is more than just a list of villains. It is a history of institutional fear. It is the story of why Hogwarts was built with such high walls and secret passages, born out of a desperate need for protection during a time when muggles and wizards were locked in a cycle of violent misunderstanding. It is the story of the 4 founders, whose own internal rift over blood purity would plant the seeds of a prejudice that would nearly destroy their society 10 centuries later. We will explore how the wizarding world moved from the chaos of the Middle Ages into a period of extreme isolationism. We'll look at the year 1692, a turning point where the entire magical community decided to vanish from the face of the earth, choosing a life of shadows over the risk of the stake and the pyre. This choice created a pressure cooker of secrecy that allowed dark ideologies to fester, unseen by the outside world. As we move through the centuries, the rise of the Unforgivable Curses and the creation of Azkaban, a place so horrific that its very existence is a testament to the darkness the Ministry was willing to employ to keep order. We will trace the ideological path of Gellert Grindelwald, who turned dark magic into a global political movement, promising a world where wizards no longer had to hide, regardless of the cost in human lives. And finally, we will arrive at the era of the 2 great wizarding wars, analysing the meticulous and terrifying rise of Lord Voldemort, a man who took the ancient scattered fragments of dark lore and forged them into a weapon of total systemic collapse. This is not just a story of spells and wands, it is a deep dive into the philosophy of power, the corruption of the soul, and the cyclical nature of evil. Why does the wizarding world keep falling into the same traps? Why do the most brilliant minds often succumb to the most horrific impulses? Tonight, as the world outside grows quiet, we will walk through the graveyards of the past, through the cold cells of the high-security wards, and into the minds of those who dared to touch the forbidden. We are going to piece together the entire timeline of the shadows, from the first serpent ever hatched in a dark cellar to the final stand on the grounds of a school that was supposed to be a sanctuary. Settle in, clear your mind, and let the weight of history carry you into the deep, dark corners of the magical world. Before there was a ministry, before there was a Hogwarts, before there was even a word for wizard, there was magic, raw, untamed, and utterly indifferent to the intentions of those who would one day try to wield it. To understand the dark history of the wizarding world, you have to understand this primordial truth. Magic is not a tool. It is a force of nature, as ancient as the earth beneath your feet, and as vast as the sky above. And like any force of nature, it contains within it the seeds of both creation and destruction. Consider the first human to accidentally speak a word of power. Perhaps it was a cry of desperation, a plea to a god they did not yet know, or a curse hurled at an enemy in the heat of a forgotten war. In that moment, the veil between thought and reality thinned. A spark of something impossible leapt from the mind into the world. That person had just touched the raw fabric of existence, and in doing so, they had opened a door that could never be fully closed again. This is the origin point, the silent birth of everything that would follow. Magic was never invented. It was discovered, and once discovered, it became a question of choice. What would you do with a power that could reshape the world with a whisper? This is the foundational tension that runs through every era of magical history. Magic, in its purest form, is neutral. It does not judge. It does not care if you use it to heal a wound or to create one. It simply responds, but the mind of a human being is not neutral. We are creatures of desire, of fear, of ambition, and so, from the very first moments of conscious magical practice, there must have been those who looked at this power and saw not responsibility, but opportunity. They saw a way to take what they wanted, to break what they hated, to become something more than the fragile mortal things they were born as. This is where the concept of the dark arts truly begins, not as a list of forbidden spells, not as a category invented by a ministry centuries later, but as a deliberate deviation, a choice to use magic in a way that subverts the natural order. It is a bending of the will of the universe to serve a single selfish purpose. And in a world without laws, without schools, without any form of oversight, that choice was made again and again, in the shadows of caves and the depths of ancient forests. The pre-literate magical world was a place of immense possibility and immense danger. There were no books of spells, no standardized wand movements. Magic was passed down through bloodlines, through whispered secrets, through trial and catastrophic error. In such a world, knowledge was the most precious and the most terrifying currency. A wizard who discovered a new way to make fire burn hotter, or a potion that could cloud a mind, held a power that was absolute, at least for a time. And it is in this environment of raw, unregulated power that the psychological allure of forbidden magic truly takes root. Why would someone choose the path of the dark arts? The answer is as old as humanity itself. Because it works. Because it offers a shortcut to a desired outcome. Because in a world where survival is uncertain, the promise of control is intoxicating. Imagine the first wizard who learned that they could force another person to do their bidding. Not through persuasion, but not through strength of arms, but through a simple, terrible act of will. The temptation must have been almost unbearable. To never be powerless again, to have every enemy become a servant, to have every fear silenced by the absolute dominion over another living soul. This is the thin veil I spoke of, the line between using magic to enhance life and using it to dominate it. It is not a line drawn in the sand by a lawmaker. It is a line drawn in the very fabric of a person's character. And in those ancient days, that line was crossed so often that it became a well-worn path. The earliest legends of the wizarding world are not stories of wise old men in towers. They are stories of shadows, of curses that could wither a harvest, of charms that could steal a man's face, of rituals that could bind a spirit to the earth long after its body had turned to dust. These were not the carefully categorized dark arts of later centuries. There was no Cruciatus curse yet, no Imperius, no killing curse with a name that would one day be spoken in fear. What existed was something more primal. It was magic used without restraint. Magic that fed on fear and pain. Magic that sought to tear down the natural boundaries between life and death, between self and other. It was the raw, unrefined ore from which all later darkness would be forged. And it is into this world, a world of whispered secrets and untamed power, that the first great name of dark history emerges. A name that would echo through the ages, not as a king or a conqueror, but as a pioneer of the forbidden. A wizard who looked at the veil between creation and destruction, and decided deliberately to tear it open. That name is Herpo the Foul, and his story is the first true chapter in the long, dark history of magic. It is a story of ambition so vast it could not be contained by a single life, and of a sin so profound it would change the nature of magic itself. We spoke last time about the primordial nature of magic, about that thin veil between creation and destruction that has always existed in the wizarding world. But what happens when a wizard deliberately reaches across that veil? Not in a moment of desperate self-defense, but with cold, calculated intent. What happens when someone decides to tear a hole in the very fabric of their own soul, not as an accident, but as a scientific experiment? That is where our story truly begins. That is where we meet the first dark wizard whose name has survived the millennia. A figure so feared that even the mention of his name was enough to make ancient Greek wizards cross to the other side of the street. His name was Herpo the Foul, and he was an ancient Greek warlock who lived sometime before the 1st century. Though the exact dates of his life have been lost to the sands of time, what we do know is that he was the first wizard to breach the sanctity of the soul, the first to treat the most sacred part of a magical being as though it were simply another ingredient to be manipulated. Herpo was not born evil in the way we might understand it today. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant and obsessive researcher, a man driven by an insatiable curiosity about the limits of magic. But that curiosity had no moral compass. It had no restraint, and it led him down a path that would scar the wizarding collective consciousness forever. Herpo lived in an age when magic was wild and untamed, when there were no ministries of magic, no international statutes of secrecy, no rules about what a wizard could or could not do. The ancient world was a place of raw, unfiltered power, where the line between life and death was thin, and where the gods themselves were said to walk among mortals. In such a world, a man like Herpo could experiment without consequence. And experiment he did. His first great achievement, if we can call it that, was the creation of the first basilisk. Now, you may have heard of basilisks from the story of the Chamber of Secrets, but the creature that Salazar Slytherin hid beneath Hogwarts was not the first of its kind. It was merely a descendant, a distant echo of the original monster that Herpo the Foul engineered in his laboratory somewhere in the Greek countryside. The basilisk is not a natural creature. It is a biological impossibility, a violation of every law of nature and magic that governs the reproduction of living things. And Herpo was the one who first achieved this impossibility. The process of creating a basilisk is one of the darkest and most closely guarded secrets in the wizarding world. What we do know is that it involves hatching a chicken egg under a toad, but that simple description belies the horrific complexity of the ritual. The egg must come from a 7-year-old rooster, a creature that is itself a biological anomaly, and it must be incubated not with warmth, but with dark magic. The toad that sits upon the egg is not a mere participant, it is a sacrifice, its life force drained to fuel the transformation that takes place within the shell. And when the egg finally hatches, what emerges is not a chick, not a toad, but something entirely new, a serpent of immense power, with venom so potent that it can kill with a single drop, and eyes that can cause instant death to anyone who meets their gaze. But Herpo did not stop there. He did not create the basilisk simply to have a deadly pet. He created it as a weapon, as a symbol of his own power, and in doing so, he established a link between the basilisk and the concept of the King of Serpents. In ancient magical lore, the basilisk is often referred to as the Serpent King, the creature that all other serpents must obey. This is not mere mythology, it is a magical truth. The basilisk possesses a form of innate parcel tongue, a language of command that forces lesser serpents to submit to its will. Herpo, who was himself a parselmouth, understood this connection intimately. He had created a creature that was an extension of his own power, a living embodiment of his dominance over the natural world. But even the creation of the basilisk was not enough for Herpo. He wanted more. He wanted to conquer death itself, and so he turned his attention to the ultimate taboo, the splitting of the soul. The creation of the first Horcrux is a moment that should have sent shockwaves through the magical world, but in those ancient times, there was no one to sound the alarm. Herpo worked in secret, in the shadows of his laboratory, surrounded by the bones of failed experiments and the flickering light of black candles. He had studied the nature of the soul, had come to understand that it was not a single, indivisible entity, but something that could be fractured, broken, and stored. The process required murder, of course. The act of killing is the most powerful way to tear the soul, to create a wound that can then be sealed into an object. But Herpo did not see murder as a moral failing. He saw it as a necessary step, a cost of doing business. And so he committed his first murder, a killing that was not born of rage or revenge, but of cold clinical calculation. He took a life, and in that moment he felt his soul rip apart. The pain must have been unimaginable, a psychic agony that would have driven a lesser wizard mad. But Herpo was not a lesser wizard. He endured the pain, and he channeled it into a spell, a ritual that had never been performed before, a piece of magic so dark that it would become the foundation of all future dark arts. He took the fragment of his soul, that torn piece of his very being, and he encased it in an object, a simple locket or a ring, the records are not clear, and in doing so, he became the first wizard to achieve a form of immortality, but the price was staggering. Herpo the Foal did not simply become immortal. He became something less than human. The loss of a piece of his soul left him diminished, his appearance note-cued, his mind warped. He was no longer the brilliant researcher he had once been. He was a monster, a creature of pure ambition and cruelty, with no empathy, no remorse, no connection to the humanity he had left behind. And the wizarding world, when it finally learned of what he had done, was horrified. The creation of the first Horcrux was not seen as a triumph. It was seen as a sin, a violation of the most fundamental laws of magic and morality. It was a scar on the collective consciousness of magical society, a reminder that some doors once opened can never be closed. Herpo the Foul eventually died, as all mortals must, even those who have split their souls. But his legacy did not die with him. The knowledge of how to create a Horcrux survived, passed down through the ages in forbidden texts and whispered rumours. Other dark wizards would follow in his footsteps, would attempt to replicate his achievement. But none would ever match the sheer audacity of the original. Herpo was the first, and in many ways, he was the worst. He was the one who showed the wizarding world that the soul could be broken, that immortality could be bought at the cost of humanity, and that knowledge, once unleashed, could never be taken back. As we move forward in our exploration of the dark history of the wizarding world, we will see how this forbidden knowledge was codified, how it was passed from one generation to the next, and how it eventually found its way into the hands of those who would use it to terrorize the world. But for now, let us sit with the weight of what Herpo the Foul accomplished. Let us understand that the darkness in later ages, the Horcruxes of Voldemort, the basilisks of Slytherin, all of it traces back to this one man, this one moment in ancient Greece, when a brilliant and broken warlock decided that the sanctity of the soul was a price worth paying for power. And as we prepare to delve into the next chapter of this story, the Codification of Evil, we will see how the seeds he planted grew into a forest of darkness that would consume the wizarding world for centuries to come. Herpo the Foul had shown the world what one mind could achieve when it turned fully toward the forbidden. He had taken the raw power of magic and bent it into shapes no one had ever imagined. A serpent that could kill with a glance, a soul that could be torn and hidden away. But his knowledge died with him, scattered in whispers and fragments. For centuries, the secrets of the dark arts remained locked inside the minds of a few, passed down from master to apprentice in hushed voices, never written, never collected. That was about to change. Because dark magic, you see, is not like other magic. It does not thrive in the open where it can be studied and debated. It festers in the shadows, passed along like a disease. But even shadows have their limits. The ancient world had shown that oral traditions were fragile. A wizard died, and his knowledge died with him. A coven was scattered, and its spells were lost. If the dark arts were to survive, if they were to grow, they needed something more permanent. They needed to be written down. And so in the 9th century, a wizard named Gaunt took the first step toward codifying evil. We know very little about Gaunt's life, where he was born, what school he attended, whether he had family or followers. What we do know is that he compiled a book so dangerous that its very name would become a whisper in the halls of magical history, he called it. Now, imagine what it meant to create such a text. Before Gaunt, dark magic was a collection of rumours and half-remembered incantations. A wizard here might know how to twist a creature's bones. A witch there might know how to place a curse that lasted beyond the grave. But no one had ever gathered all these threads together and woven them into a single coherent system. Gaunt changed that. He sat in his workshop, surrounded by candles and parchment, and he wrote down everything. The spells for summoning shadows, the rituals for binding spirits, the incantations that could turn a man's skin to stone or his mind to dust. But it was not merely a list of curses. It was a philosophy. Gellert argued that dark magic was not evil in itself, that it was simply magic, stripped of the moral chains that the weak had placed upon it. He wrote that the true wizard should fear nothing, that power was its own justification, and he taught that the greatest magic came from the deepest sacrifice. These ideas would echo for centuries, finding their way into the hands of wizards who believed they were above the laws of men and nature. The book itself became a legend. Copies were made, hidden in vaults and libraries across Europe. It was said that reading even a single page could corrupt the mind, that the ink was mixed with the blood of the author, that the words moved on the page to avoid being read by the pure of heart. Whether these stories are true or not is almost beside the point. The very existence of changed the way wizards thought about forbidden knowledge. For the first time, the dark arts had a textbook, and that textbook would soon be joined by another artifact of immense power. Around the same period, a different kind of dark magic began to surface in the historical records. It was not a spell or a potion, it was a wand that would become the most coveted object in the wizarding world. The Elder Wand now. The origins of the Elder Wand are shrouded in myth. Some say it was created by Death himself. Others claim it was carved from a branch of an ancient tree that grew on the boundary between life and the afterlife. But what we do know is that by the 9th century, the wand had already begun its long and bloody journey through history. It passed from hand to hand, always through violence. Its power was undeniable. It could win any enchantment, break any bond, but it carried a curse of its own. Every master of the Elder Wand would eventually be killed by the one who claimed it next. The emergence of the Elder Wand in these early records was a catalyst. It proved that dark magic was not only a matter of spells and incantations, it could be embodied in an object. A wand that chose only the ambitious, the ruthless, the willing to kill. It became a symbol of what dark magic could achieve when it was pure, concentrated and unbound. Wizards who heard the tales of the Elder Wand began to dream of similar power. They began to search for other artifacts, other weapons, other ways to cheat death and dominate life. And so the codification of evil continued. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, the dark arts were no longer a collection of whispers. They were a written tradition, a system, a discipline, and that made them infinitely more dangerous. But even as the books multiplied and the wands changed hands, there was one place where darkness had taken root in a way that no manuscript could capture, a place where the very stones seemed to breathe malice. A fortress built on a hidden island, where a wizard named Ekrizdis practiced horrors that would never be written down, because no one who saw them ever lived to tell the tale. And that is where our story must go next. As the codified knowledge of dark magic passed from hand to hand, as the grimoires and forbidden texts found their way into hidden libraries across Europe, something else was stirring in the frozen waters of the North Sea. A single mind, twisted beyond the pale of sanity, began to construct a fortress that would come to symbolize the absolute worst of wizarding cruelty. This is the story of Ekrizdis. The name itself feels like a whisper on the wind, a sound that chills the air before you even know its meaning. Very little is known about the wizard who called himself Ekrizdis, and that is precisely the way history has remembered him. As a figure shrouded in fog, a ghost made of rumour and dread. What we do know is that sometime in the 15th century, he discovered an island, a jagged black outcropping far from any trade route, hidden from Muggle charts by both magic and geography. He named it Azkaban, though no one is quite certain what the word meant in his tongue. Perhaps it was a corruption of an ancient incantation, or perhaps it was simply the sound of despair given a name. Ekrizdis was not content to simply occupy that barren rock. He bent the island to his will, raising towers of obsidian and bone, shaping the very stone with spells that had not been spoken since the days of Herpo the Foul. The fortress that emerged was a place of angles that hurt the eyes, of corridors that seemed to breathe, of rooms that never held sunlight even at midday. But the fortress was not the true horror. The true horror was what Ekrizdis did there, night after night. He was a master of luring, of deception, of the kind of dark magic that preyed upon the living. He would send out phantom lights across the water, false beacons that promised safe harbour, and the Muggle sailors, tired and desperate for land, would steer their ships directly toward the rocks. Those who survived the wrecks were dragged into the fortress, and there they met a slow, deliberate fate that served a single purpose: the amplification of despair. You see, Ekrizdis had discovered something profound about the nature of dark energy. Spells of torment and suffering, when inflicted upon innocent souls, released a particular kind of power, a resonance that could be harvested and stored. The more terrified the victim, the more prolonged the agony, the richer the harvest. He conducted these rituals not for any political ambition, not to conquer nations, but simply to feed a hunger that grew with each scream. The island became a crucible of concentrated misery. The walls absorbed the anguish. The very air thickened with sorrow, and in that atmosphere of utter hopelessness, something began to manifest. It was not a creature in the traditional sense, not something that could be born or hatched. It was a byproduct, a living shadow given form by the sheer weight of human suffering. These were the first Dementors. They coalesced from the dark energy that Ekrizdis had cultivated, feeding on the emotions of his prisoners, multiplying in the cold stone corridors. Some historians believe that Ekrizdis did not create them intentionally, that they were an accidental side effect of his rituals, a kind of magical pollution that took on a life of its own. But once they existed, they became extensions of his will, silent guardians that prowled the fortress, ensuring that no prisoner ever escaped, not even in their minds. For a Dementor does not merely guard a body, it consumes the spirit. And as decades passed, Ekrizdis himself began to change. The dark energy he had summoned could not be contained forever. It seeped into his flesh, his thoughts, his very soul. Some say he disappeared, consumed by his own creation. Others believe he became the first Dementor, a king of shadows ruling a kingdom of ash. When Ekrizdis finally vanished, the fortress of Azkaban did not crumble. It remained a rotten tooth in the jaw of the North Sea, abandoned but not empty. The Dementors lingered, breeding in the dark, waiting for fresh misery to feed upon. For centuries, the island was avoided by wizards and muggles alike, a cursed place that appeared on no map. Only when the Ministry of Magic, in its desperate need to contain the growing tide of dark wizards, discovered the island, did they realize its terrible potential as a prison. They did not cleanse it. They did not drive out the Dementors. They simply repurposed the fortress, adding iron bars and locks, and filled it with the worst criminals in the magical world. And that decision, that choice to use Ekrizdis' dark legacy as a tool of state punishment, would echo through the centuries, shaping the very nature of wizarding justice. But the island's origins, the luring of those Muggle sailors, the experimental rituals that birthed the Dementors, all of that was buried, forgotten by all but the most dedicated historians. Yet the guilt remains, soaked into the stone like old blood. The Fortress of Ekrizdis stands as a monument to what happens when dark knowledge is pursued without restraint, when one wizard's obsession becomes the prison of generations. And as we turn from this frozen, grief-stricken place, we find ourselves moving back toward the heart of the magical world, toward a school that was founded for an entirely different purpose. Not to imprison, but to teach. Not to isolate, but to unite. But even there, in the halls of Hogwarts, the shadows of division were already gathering. The Fortress of Ekrizdis was not a place that could be easily forgotten. Even after it was abandoned, its shadow lingered in the North Sea, a stain upon the waters that sailors whispered about for centuries. But even as that terrible island sank into ruin, and eventually into the hands of the Ministry, the world of magic was undergoing a transformation far more profound than any single dark wizard's lair could represent. The 11th century was drawing to a close, and with it came a new era, one defined not by isolated horrors, but by a growing systemic fear that would reshape everything. By the 10th century, the relationship between magical people and muggles had reached a breaking point. For centuries, the two worlds had coexisted in a state of uneasy tension, but the balance was shifting. Muggles were becoming more organized, more suspicious, and more dangerous. The rise of feudal systems and the spread of organized religion brought with them a new kind of persecution. Witch hunts were not yet the organized panics of later centuries, but the seeds were being sown. Magical folk were burned, drowned, and hanged in trials that were as absurd as they were brutal. A muggle who could not swim was considered a witch, while one who could was condemned as a demon. There was no logic, only fear, and fear has a way of spreading faster than fire. It was in this climate of paranoia and violence that the idea of Hogwarts was born. 4 of the most powerful witches and wizards of the age recognized that the magical community could not survive if it remained scattered and isolated. They saw children being born with uncontrollable magic, children who were abandoned by terrified parents or worse, turned over to the mob. They saw ancient families retreating into the shadows. And so Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin came together to build a sanctuary. But a sanctuary built by 4 such different minds could never be a simple refuge. Each founder brought their own vision, their own values, and their own fears. Gryffindor valued courage above all else, believing that a brave heart could overcome any obstacle. Hufflepuff championed loyalty and hard work, welcoming anyone who was willing to learn. Ravenclaw prized wisdom and wit, seeking to unlock the deepest mysteries of magic. And Slytherin, the most pragmatic and perhaps the most haunted by the persecution of his time, believed that magical blood was the only thing that could be trusted. The rift between Slytherin and his peers was not born overnight. It grew slowly, like a crack in a foundation that no one wanted to acknowledge. At first, the disagreements were subtle. Slytherin argued for stricter admissions, or testing the lineage of students before allowing them through the gates. He believed that Muggle-born witches and wizards, however talented, were a liability. They carried the blood of the very people who hunted them. And he feared that their presence would invite betrayal. He had seen too many families destroyed by Muggle informants, too many safe houses compromised by those who could not fully sever their ties to the non-magical world. Gryffindor, by contrast, saw the potential in every magical child. He argued that courage and character were not determined by blood, but by the choices one made. Hufflepuff agreed, insisting that everyone deserved a chance to prove themselves. Ravenclaw, ever the intellectual, pointed out that some of the most brilliant magical discoveries had come from Muggle-born scholars who brought fresh perspectives to ancient traditions. But Slytherin was unmoved. He had seen too much, lost too much to believe in such idealism. The tension came to a head during the construction of the castle itself. As the walls rose and the towers reached for the sky, Slytherin began to plan in secret. He did not trust the future that his fellow founders were building. He believed that one day the sanctuary they had created would be infiltrated, corrupted, or simply abandoned by those who did not understand the true nature of magic. And so he built a contingency. Deep beneath the castle, far below the dungeons and the cellars, he constructed a chamber that no one else knew about. A hidden room that would remain sealed until his true heir returned to open it. The Chamber of Secrets was not merely a room. It was a vault of Slytherin's darkest fears and his most bitter resentments. And within that vault, he left a guardian, a creature born of the oldest and most terrible magic, a basilisk, descended from the very first one created by Herpo the Fool. This was not a pet or a simple defense mechanism. It was a weapon designed to purge the school of those Slytherin considered unworthy. He left it there, sleeping in the darkness, waiting for the day when his voice would call it forth. The other founders never knew. They finished the castle, established the houses, and began teaching the first generation of students. But the seeds of division had been sown. Slytherin's insistence on blood purity became a doctrine that would be passed down through his house for centuries. His followers would whisper about the chamber, about the monster that slept beneath their feet, and about the day when the heir of Slytherin would rise again to cleanse the school. As the decades passed, the founders aged and eventually passed from the world. Gryffindor's sword was left as a legacy, Hufflepuff's cup, Ravenclaw's diadem, and Slytherin's locket. But the chamber remained, a ticking time bomb, hidden within the very heart of the sanctuary. the school that was meant to protect magical children from persecution, become the vessel for a prejudice that would one day tear it apart. The great divide between Slytherin and his peers was not just a disagreement about admissions policy. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews, a conflict between hope and fear, between inclusion and survival. And in the end, fear won. Slytherin left the school, but his legacy remained, embedded in the stones of Hogwarts like a curse waiting to be spoken. The centuries that followed would see the persecution of magical folk grow even more intense. The burning times were coming, a period of such widespread terror that the magical community would be forced to make a choice that would change everything. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, the foundations had been laid, both the visible ones and the hidden ones, and the future of the wizarding world was already being written in the shadows of the past. The rift between Salazar Slytherin and the other founders was not merely a philosophical disagreement about blood purity. It was a symptom of a much deeper wound, one that had been festering in the magical community for centuries. By the time Hogwarts was built, the fear of Muggles had already become a cultural inheritance, passed down from parent to child like a cursed heirloom. But that fear would soon transform into something far more dangerous. It would become a crucible, one that forged the modern wizarding world through fire, ash, and the screams of the innocent. The period that would later be called the Burning Times was not a single event. It was a slow, creeping horror that spread across Europe like a plague of suspicion. For centuries, Muggles had always known that magic existed. They feared it, they respected it, and they often tried to destroy it. But in the late Middle Ages, something shifted. The fear of witches and warlocks became institutionalized. It became a profession. The witch hunters of the Muggle world were not random mobs. They were organized, methodical, and armed with manuals that described exactly how to identify, torture, and execute those who practiced the old arts. For the wizarding community, this was a time of profound psychological trauma. Imagine growing up in a world where your neighbour could be burned alive for simply being suspected of having a gift you were born with. Imagine watching your parents, your siblings, your friends dragged to the stake because a Muggle authority decided they looked too strange, too clever, or too unlucky. This was not a distant threat. It was a daily reality. The wizarding psyche was shaped by this constant state of siege. Families began to radicalize. They stopped trusting anyone outside their own bloodline. They built walls, not just around their homes, but around their hearts. And yet, something remarkable happened. The magical community, despite its terror, began to fight back in ways that were both clever and darkly humorous. This brings us to one of the most peculiar figures in wizarding history, Wendelin the Weird. Wendelin was a witch who lived during the 14th century, and she is remembered not for her magical achievements, but for her bizarre obsession with being burned at the stake. You see, Wendelin had discovered Muggle fire, the kind used in witch burnings, was completely harmless to a properly trained witch or wizard. A simple flame-freezing charm was all it took to turn a death sentence into a rather warm and ticklish experience. So Wendelin did something that would have been unthinkable to her terrified contemporaries. She allowed herself to be caught, again and again. Historical records suggest she was burned at the stake no fewer than 47 times. Now on the surface, this sounds like a joke, and in many ways it was. Wendelin was mocking the Muggles. She was turning their greatest weapon into a carnival trick. But there is a darker layer to her story. The fact that she could do this, that she could treat execution as a game, reveals just how wide the gap had become between the magical and non-magical worlds. The Muggles were not just failing to kill witches, they were failing to understand them at all. And that misunderstanding, that fundamental blindness, would have consequences far beyond the burning times. The wizarding world watched as Muggle authorities burned empty stakes, celebrated false victories, and grew ever more paranoid. And they began to ask a question that would echo through the centuries. Why should we live among them at all? Why should we hide in their villages, marry into their families, pretend to be something we are not? Why should we continue to suffer for their ignorance? This was the seed of the isolationist movement. It was not born from hatred, at least not at first. It was born from exhaustion, from grief, from the simple, desperate desire to survive. The first formal discussions of total magical isolation began in secret gatherings, in the back rooms of taverns, in the hidden chambers of wizarding homes. Families who had lost loved ones to the flames argued that the only way to protect their children was to sever all ties with the Muggle world. They proposed a complete withdrawal, a magical curtain that would separate the two worlds forever, but not everyone agreed. There were those who believed that hiding was cowardice. There were those who had Muggle friends, Muggle lovers, Muggle family members they could not abandon. There were those who remembered a time when witches and wizards walked openly among Muggles, when magic was a gift shared with the world, not a curse to be hidden. The debate was fierce, and it would rage for centuries, but the Burning Times had already done its work. The fear was already embedded in the wizarding psyche. The radicalization of families was already complete. The question was no longer whether to hide, but how. And so as the flames of the Burning Times began to die down, a new kind of fire was kindled, a fire of resolve, a fire of separation. The wizarding world would not be destroyed by Muggle ignorance. It would simply vanish. It would become a ghost, a rumor, a legend, and in doing so, it would protect itself from the very real threat of extinction. But this decision, this great withdrawal, would come at a cost. It would require a formal agreement, a binding statute that would change the course of magical history forever. That statute would be signed in the year 1692, and it would be called the International Statute of Secrecy. But before we reach that moment, we must understand what led to it. We must understand the centuries of persecution, the mockery of Wendlin, the weird, the quiet desperation of families who chose isolation over annihilation, and we must understand that the Statute of Secrecy was not a beginning, it was an ending. The end of a world where magic and Muggle could coexist, and the beginning of a world where they would never truly trust each other again. The Burning Times left deep scars on the wizarding world. For centuries, magical folk had lived alongside Muggles, sometimes in open cooperation, sometimes in uneasy truce, but always with a fundamental understanding that their existence was known. The witch hunts of the late Middle Ages changed everything. They were not the first persecution, but they were the most systematic, the most widespread, and the most psychologically devastating. Thousands of witches and wizards perished, not because they could not defend themselves, but because the code of secrecy that had informally governed magical society for generations demanded restraint. You could not reveal your powers to save yourself without betraying your entire community, and so many chose death over exposure. But the trauma of those centuries did more than kill the innocent. It radicalized the survivors. It convinced the most powerful families in the magical world that coexistence was a failed experiment. The Muggles were not simply ignorant, they were dangerous, and they could not be trusted with the truth. By the late 17th century, the sentiment had become overwhelming. The wizarding world was fractured, not by internal conflict, but by a shared fear that had become a kind of collective paranoia. Every village, every town, every city held the potential for another outbreak of violence. The magical population had retreated into the shadows, but the shadows were not safe. Muggles still hunted them. Muggles still burned them. Muggles still drowned them in rivers and hanged them in town squares. The old ways of hiding in plain sight, of using simple charms to deflect suspicion, were no longer sufficient. The world was changing. The Muggles were growing in number, in organization, in technology. They were mapping the continents, building empires, and standardizing their languages and laws. The magical world could no longer afford to be a secret, whispered in the dark. It needed to become invisible entirely. And so, in the year 1692, representatives from every major magical government gathered in a location that has never been publicly disclosed. Some accounts say it was a remote island in the North Sea. Others claim it was a hidden chamber beneath the streets of Paris. What is certain is that the meeting produced the most consequential document in the history of the magical world. The International Statute of Secrecy. The signing of the International Statute of Secrecy and the permanent fracturing of the world was not a single moment of agreement, but a long and bitter negotiation that nearly collapsed into war. The magical communities of Asia and Africa were deeply reluctant to abandon the open relationships they had maintained with their Muggle neighbours for millennia. The European delegates, however, were insistent. They had seen the worst of the burning times. They had lost families, friends, and entire bloodlines to the flames. They argued that secrecy was not a choice, but a necessity for survival. In the end, the European position prevailed, but the cost was immense. The magical world became a hidden world, and the bonds between magical and non-magical people were severed forever. The logistical nightmare of hiding an entire civilization and the obliviation of history began immediately after the ink dried on the parchment. The statute required every magical government to withdraw from Muggle society, to conceal all magical creatures and artifacts, and to ensure that no evidence of magic remained in the public record. This was not a simple task. For centuries, wizards and witches had lived openly. They had served as advisors to kings, as healers in villages, as builders of great structures that still stand today. All of that had to be erased. The Obliviators, a specialized corps of memory charmers, were dispatched across the globe. They modified the memories of millions of Muggles, replacing encounters with magic with mundane explanations. A dragon seen flying over a village became a flock of birds. A wizard casting a spell became a trick of the light. A magical duel in a city square became a street brawl. The history books were rewritten. The legends were dismissed as superstition. The truth was buried so deeply that even most Muggles who had witnessed magic firsthand came to doubt their own memories. But the Obliviation was not only about erasing the past, it was about controlling the future. The statute established strict penalties for any wizard or witch who revealed their abilities to a Muggle. The punishment could range from fines to imprisonment to, in extreme cases, the destruction of one's wand. The magical world became a closed system, self-governing and self-policing, and within that closed system, a new social hierarchy began to emerge. The families who had survived the burning times with their wealth and influence intact were the ones who shaped the new order. They were the ones who had the resources to hide, the connections to protect their own, and the ambition to rule in the shadows. Among these families were the Malfoys and the Blacks, names that would become synonymous with the pure-blood aristocracy of the centuries to come. The rise of the Malfoy and Black families as architects of the new underground social hierarchy was not accidental. Both families had been prominent in the medieval magical world, but the burning times had forced them to adapt. The Malfoys, in particular, had cultivated relationships with Muggle royalty for generations, using their wealth and influence to secure protection and privilege. When the Statute of Secrecy made those relationships impossible to maintain openly, the Malfoys simply redirected their efforts inward. They became the bankers, the landowners, the patrons of the new hidden society. The Blacks, by contrast, had always been more insular, more focused on blood purity and magical lineage. They saw the statute as an opportunity to purify the magical world, to purge it of Muggle influences, and to establish a ruling class based on ancestry rather than merit. Together, these families and their allies created the social structure that would define the wizarding world. For the next 3 centuries, they built the networks of patronage and marriage that would produce the Death Eaters and the Order of the Phoenix, the heroes of the wars to come. The Statute of Secrecy was supposed to bring peace. It was supposed to protect the magical world from persecution, and allow it to flourish in secret. And in many ways it succeeded. The witch hunts ended, the magical population stabilized. New generations of witches and wizards were born into a world where their powers were a private inheritance, not a public threat. But the cost of that peace was isolation. The magical world became a world apart, disconnected from the progress and the problems of the Muggle world. It became insular, suspicious, and obsessed with its own internal divisions. The pure blood ideology that had simmered beneath the surface for centuries now had room to grow unchecked. The families who controlled the new order were the ones who had the most to lose from openness, and they were the ones who would fight the hardest to keep the magical world hidden, even from itself. The signing of the International Statute of Secrecy was not the end of the dark history of the wizarding world. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the darkness would be internal rather than external. The Muggles were no longer the enemy. The enemy was now within, and the institutions that were created to enforce the statute, the Ministry of Magic, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the Wizengamot, would soon become the stage for the next great conflict. The world had been fractured, and the pieces were already being gathered by hands that would shape the future in ways no one at that secret meeting could have imagined. The story of that shaping, of the birth of the ministry and the consolidation of power in the hands of a few, is the story of the next chapter in this long and troubled history. It is the story of how the magical world built its cage, and how that cage would one day become a prison for the very souls it was meant to protect. The International Statute of Secrecy had been signed, and the world of magic had locked itself away behind a veil of obliviation and silence. But what the law demanded, and what reality delivered, were two very different things. In the years following the Great Secrecy, the wizarding world was not a peaceful, hidden utopia. It was a terrified, fractured, and often violent society, scrambling to police itself while Muggles unknowingly walked past doors that led to entire hidden streets. The old governing body, the Wizards' Council, had been a loose assembly of the most powerful and the most well-connected, a council that had operated for centuries on tradition rather than codified law. After the statute, that council became a relic almost overnight. It was not designed to manage entire populations of magical people now forced to live in a parallel world. It was not equipped to patrol borders, to maintain secrecy, to stop rogue wizards from breaking the very law that was meant to protect them all. Chaos crept in like a slow poison. Reports of magical accidents and deliberate violations flooded the council's chambers. A wizard in Nottingham had been seen by a dozen Muggles while attempting to transfigure a cow into a wardrobe. A coven in the Highlands had refused to abandon their public Sabbaths, arguing that the statute was an insult to their ancient traditions. And worst of all, the very concept of dark magic had no formal definition. The council could punish a wizard for harming a Muggle. But what about spells that merely twisted the mind, or curses that left no visible wound? What about the old rituals that involved blood and sacrifice, but did not kill? The council argued for months, years even, and the arguments grew heated. Some members insisted that any magic that caused permanent harm should be classified as dark. Others, many of them descendants of families who practiced questionable arts, fought to keep the definition narrow. And while they debated, the chaos deepened. It became clear that the Wizards' Council was no longer fit for purpose. The very word council evoked images of a small group of elders meeting in a dusty tower, while the wizarding population had swelled into thousands of hidden communities across Britain alone. The system needed to be replaced with something more structured, more bureaucratic, more capable of enforcing the new reality. And so, in a series of stormy sessions that lasted through the early 1700s, the council voted to dissolve itself. In its place, a new governing body emerged, the Ministry of Magic. It was not a single moment of transformation, but a slow, grinding shift from the old ways to the new. The ministry was designed to be a permanent institution, with departments, hierarchies, and standardized procedures. It was a response to the chaos, an attempt to impose order on a world that had just decided to hide from the non-magical one. And with that order came control. One of the first and most important departments there was the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It was the ministry's arm for policing the magical community, and it faced an immediate and impossible task: to define what exactly it was enforcing against. The term dark arts had been used for centuries, but it had always been vague, a label applied to whatever magic the speaker found distasteful or frightening. The early department had to create a legal framework from scratch. They could not simply say, all curses are forbidden, because many curses were used in everyday dueling or self-defense. They could not say, any magic that kills is dark, because the killing curse itself was not yet fully understood by the authorities. And there were countless ways to kill with magic that did not involve a spoken incantation. The struggle to define dark became a philosophical war within the ministry. Some officials argued that dark magic was any magic that required a malicious intent, but that was impossible to prove. Others argued that it should be based solely on the spell itself. Regardless of the caster's intention, the debates were long, the notes were thick, and the decisions were often arbitrary. What emerged was a series of interim classifications, a list of spells and practices that the department considered too dangerous to be left unregulated, but the definition remained porous. A wizard could brew a poison that caused agonizing death and be charged only with manslaughter if the poison was considered a potion rather than a curse. A witch could place a jinx on a neighbor that caused their hair to fall out permanently, and it might be treated as a minor offense if the jinx was not on the official list. The early department was overwhelmed, understaffed, and often forced to rely on the very families they were trying to police. The old powerful lines, the Malfoys, the Blacks, the Lestranges, had their own definitions of dark magic, and they were not always aligned with the ministry's. In many ways, the ministry's attempt to define darkness only pushed the true practitioners further into the shadows, where they became even harder to track. But the institutionalization of magical control did not stop at law enforcement. The ministry began to regulate almost every aspect of wizarding life. It created the Wizengamot, a judicial body that would become the highest court in magical Britain. It established rules for the use of wands, for the breeding of magical creatures, for the sale of potions and artifacts. It required all magical children to be registered at birth, and it started to keep detailed records of every witch and wizard in the country. These measures were sold as necessary for the protection of the community. And in many ways they were, but they came at a price. Individual wizarding liberties, the freedoms that had been taken for granted for centuries, began to slip away. Before the ministry, a wizard could travel where he pleased, cast any spell he knew, and answer to no one but the local community. After the ministry, every spell that left a trace, every apparition into a populated area, every use of a potentially harmful charm could be tracked, recorded, and punished. The old unpredictability of magic, the wild, untamed power that had once made wizards both feared and respected by muggles, was now seen as a liability. The ministry wanted order, and order required conformity. The darker side of magic was not the only thing being regulated. The very nature of what it meant to be a witch or wizard was being rewritten into a bureaucratic identity. You were no longer a sorcerer, a sage, a wielder of ancient forces. You were a citizen of the magical state, subject to its laws, its inspections, and its judgments. For many families, especially those who had lived on the fringes of society, this shift was a betrayal. They had hidden from muggles for centuries, not because they wanted to be ruled by a ministry, but because they wanted to be left alone. Now they were being told that they must attend school, register their wands, and report any accidents or outbreaks of accidental magic. The new laws did not distinguish between a child who caused a flower to bloom and a wizard who tortured a muggle. Both were magical acts that could be tracked. Both required paperwork. The institutionalization of control spread like roots through the soil of magical society, and with every new rule, a little more freedom was lost. And yet, for all the Ministry's efforts, the dark magic it sought to contain only grew more sophisticated. The practitioners who had once operated in the open now had to be more careful, more cunning. They began to develop spells that left no trace, potions that masked their intent, and artifacts that could bypass the new security measures. The Ministry's classification system, born from the struggle to define the word dark, became a cat-and-mouse game. Every time a new forbidden curse was added to the list, a counter-curse or a loophole was discovered. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement found itself fighting a war of definitions, a war that would never truly end. It was in this atmosphere of tension and fear that the Ministry finally made its most drastic move. The classification of the 3 most terrible curses in the magical world was not a casual decision. It was the culmination of decades of debate, tragedy, and political maneuvering. The spells that would become known as the Unforgivable Curses had been used in secret for centuries, but after the birth of the Ministry, their use became more visible and more unacceptable. The department knew that to maintain control, it had to draw a line in the sand, a line that would separate the tolerable from the unforgivable, a line that would, in time, become one of the darkest chapters in the history of magical law. But that is a story for the next chapter, when the Ministry's definition of evil was finally carved into stone. The Ministry of Magic, in its earliest years, was a creature of reaction. It had been born from the chaos of the Statute of Secrecy, a bureaucratic skeleton hastily assembled to manage the impossible task of hiding an entire civilization. Its first laws were practical, almost mundane: regulations on dragon breeding, restrictions on underage magic, guidelines for the proper disposal of enchanted waste. But as the 18th century dawned, the Ministry faced a question it had been dreading. What exactly was dark magic? And more importantly, where did the line between dangerous and unforgivable truly lie? For centuries, the Wizards' Council had dealt with magical crime on a case-by-case basis. A wizard who used a curse to harm a muggle might be sentenced to a decade in the dungeons. A witch who brewed a poison that killed a rival might face the same. There was no hierarchy of evil, no formal distinction between a hex that caused a nasty rash and a spell that ripped a soul from its body. But as the Ministry began to catalogue and codify magical law, the old system became untenable. You could not build a stable government on a foundation of arbitrary justice. You needed definitions. You needed categories, and you needed, above all else, a clear and unambiguous line beyond which no wizard could cross and ever be welcomed back into society. That line was drawn in the year 1717. The decision was not made lightly, nor was it made in secret. The Wizengamot, the highest court in magical Britain, convened for what would become one of the most consequential sessions in its history. The debate lasted for weeks. Aurors testified about the horrors they had witnessed in the field. Healers described the irreversible damage done to victims who had survived the Cruciatus curse. Mind healers spoke of patients whose wills had been so thoroughly broken by the Imperiosus curse that they could no longer remember who they had been before. And then there was the killing curse. Avada Kedavra, a spell with no counter, no defense, no second chance. A flash of green light, and a life ended, instantly, irrevocably, without pain but also without mercy. The Wizengamot understood that they were not merely banning 3 spells. They were making a statement about the nature of magic itself. Magic, at its core, was a tool. It could build or destroy, heal or harm, create or annihilate. But these 3 curses were different. They were not tools. They were weapons designed for a single, terrible purpose. The Cruciatus curse existed only to inflict suffering. The Imperious curse existed only to steal autonomy. And Avada Kedavra existed only to kill. There was no benign application for any of them. You could not use the Cruciatus curse to cure a disease. You could not use the Imperious Curse to calm a frightened child. You could not use the Killing Curse to put a suffering animal out of its misery, because the spell required a level of hatred and intent that made mercy impossible. And so, on a cold autumn morning in 1717, the Wizengamot voted. The 3 curses were classified as unforgivable. The punishment for using any of them on a fellow human being was life imprisonment in Azkaban. There would be no appeals, no mitigating circumstances, no second chances. The line had been drawn, but the philosophical debate did not end with the vote. In fact, it only grew louder. Critics of the new law argued that the ministry had made a dangerous mistake. By declaring these 3 curses unforgivable, they had created a hierarchy of evil that did not exist in nature. Was a wizard who used a slow-acting poison to murder an enemy truly less evil than one who used Avada Kedavra? Was a witch who manipulated a rival's mind through subtle potions and enchantments truly less culpable than one who cast the Imperious Curse? The law, the critics said, was arbitrary. It punished the method of the crime rather than the intent behind it. Supporters of the law countered with a simple, brutal argument. The unforgivable curses were not just more evil than other spells, they were qualitatively different. A poison could be brewed for legitimate purposes. A mind-altering potion could be used in healing. But the 3 curses had no purpose beyond destruction. They were the magical equivalent of a blade forged solely for murder. To use them was to announce to the world that you had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The curse did not make you evil. It revealed that you already were. The immediate impact on the wizarding underworld was profound. For centuries, dark wizards had operated with relative impunity, using the most brutal spells available without fear of legal consequence. The unforgivable curses had been their weapons of choice, the tools that allowed a single wizard to dominate, torture, and kill with terrifying efficiency. But now, the use of those curses carried a penalty that even the most hardened criminals feared. Life in Azkaban was not a sentence. It was a death warrant, slow and agonizing, in a fortress where the walls themselves seemed to feed on hope. The underworld adapted. Dark wizards did not stop practicing dark magic. They simply became more subtle. The Cruciatus Curse was replaced by slower, more insidious forms of torture. The Imperious Curse was replaced by carefully brewed potions and long-term psychological manipulation. Avada Kedavra was replaced by poisons, accidents, and the careful orchestration of events that left no magical trace. The ministry had won a battle, but the war had merely changed its shape. The darkness did not retreat, it learned to hide, and this perhaps is the most unsettling truth about the unforgivable curses. They were not the beginning of evil in the wizarding world. They were not even the worst of it. They were simply the most honest. A wizard who casts the Cruciatus Curse cannot pretend he is doing anything other than causing pain. A witch who casts the Imperious Curse cannot pretend she is doing anything other than stealing a soul. And a wizard who casts Avada Kedavra cannot pretend he is doing anything other than ending a life. The curses strip away the lies we tell ourselves about power and control. They force us to look at what we are doing and admit that we have chosen to become monsters. But what of the monsters who do not use these curses? What of the wizards who torture slowly, who manipulate carefully, who kill without a flash of green light? Are they any less evil because their methods are more refined? The ministry in 1717 made a choice. It decided that crime vassals were so heinous, so fundamentally opposed to the nature of civilized magic, that they could never be forgiven. But in making that choice, it also created a loophole. If you could achieve the same result without using the forbidden words, you could still walk free. And so the darkness learned to speak in whispers. The unforgivable curses became the ultimate taboo, the line that no respectable wizard would cross. But the line itself became a kind of shield. Those who operated just on the safe side of it could claim a kind of moral superiority, even as their hands were stained with blood. The ministry had drawn a line in the sand, but the tide of dark magic did not stop at that line. It simply flowed around it. The prison that would hold those who crossed that line was already waiting. A fortress built on a hidden island, a place where the walls remembered every scream, every tear, every moment of despair. The Ministry had the law, it had the curses, but it had not yet built the institution that would become the ultimate symbol of its power and its failure. That story was about to begin, and it would begin in a place where hope went to die. A place that would one day be known as Azkaban. The classification of the Unforgivable Curses in 1717 was a landmark, but it created a new problem. What do you do with a wizard who has been caught casting the killing curse? Where do you put someone who has used the Cruciatus curse to break a mind? The old Wizards' Council had dungeons, yes, but they were temporary holding cells, not long-term prisons. The Ministry of Magic, newly formed and still finding its footing, needed a solution, and the solution they found would become one of the darkest stains on magical history. There was an island in the North Sea, a bleak, jagged outcrop of rock that seemed to repel the very light of the sun. It had been uninhabited for centuries, and for good reason. The place was a fortress, built by a wizard named Ekrizdis, a name that was barely a whisper even in the most arcane texts. Ekrizdis was not a builder of homes or a scholar of benign magic. He was a practitioner of the most terrible arts, and he constructed his fortress on that island as a playground for his cruelty. He lured Muggle sailors to his shores, not to rob them, but to experiment on them. He wove spells into the very stone of the fortress, spells that fed on despair and amplified fear. And then he summoned creatures to guard his domain, creatures that were not alive, not dead, but something in between, Dementors. When Ekrizdis finally died, and the Ministry dared to investigate the island, they found the fortress empty of its master, but not empty of its horrors. The Dementors had multiplied. They had grown fat on the residual misery of Ekrizdis's victims, and they now drifted through the cold corridors as the sole inhabitants of that place. The Ministry Aurors who explored the fortress reported a feeling of such profound hopelessness that many of them required weeks of recovery. They wanted to destroy the place, to tear it down stone by stone and drive the Dementors out into the sea. But they did not. They saw an opportunity. The Ministry's controversial decision to use the Dementor-infested fortress as a federal prison was not made lightly, but it was made quickly. The argument was pragmatic. Where else could they hold the most dangerous dark wizards? Building a new prison would take decades and cost a fortune. Azkaban was already there. It was impenetrable. The Dementors, they reasoned, were the perfect guards. They did not need to be paid. They did not need to sleep. They did not need to eat, at least not in any conventional sense. They fed on happiness, on hope, on the very essence of a human soul. And what better place to find a steady supply of that sustenance than a prison full of criminals? The Ministry made a deal with the Dementors. The creatures would be allowed to stay in Azkaban, to patrol its halls and guard its prisoners. In exchange, they would be given free access to the emotional energy of the inmates. It was a contract written in misery, and so the first prisoners were shipped to Azkaban. They were chained in the holds of Ministry vessels, their wands snapped, their bodies bound. They were dragged onto the island and thrown into cells that had once been Ekrizdis's torture chambers. The walls were damp, the air was cold, and the Dementors were always there, just outside the iron bars, waiting. The tales of the first prisoners who lost their minds within the lightless walls are not stories of dramatic escapes or heroic resistance. They are stories of slow, quiet dissolution. A man who had once been a brilliant curse-breaker would sit in his cell for weeks, staring at a single crack in the stone, his lips moving silently. A woman who had been a feared dark witch would forget her own name, would forget that she had ever known magic at all. The Dementors did not need to torture them. They simply drained them, day after day, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. The ethical decay of a government that uses soul-sucking entities to maintain order was not something the Ministry wanted to examine too closely. They told themselves that the prisoners deserved it, that these were the worst of the worst. The ones who had cast the unforgivable curses, the ones who had murdered and maimed. But the logic was a slippery slope. If it was acceptable to use Dementors on murderers, why not on thieves? Why not on political dissidents? The Ministry began to send more and more prisoners to Azkaban. Not just for the darkest crimes, but for any crime that seemed too difficult to handle otherwise. The prison became a dumping ground for the inconvenient, and the Dementors grew stronger. They began to breed. The cold of Azkaban seeped into the magical world itself, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The fortress on that island became a symbol, not of justice, but of the Ministry's willingness to sacrifice its own principles for the sake of order. They had created a monster to contain monsters, and in doing so, they had become something monstrous themselves. The Dementors were not just guards, they were an extension of the state's power, a silent threat that hung over every wizard who dared to step out of line. The Ministry had traded its soul for security, and the price was paid in the endless, silent screams of the prisoners in the lightless cells. This was the true horror of Azkaban. It was not just a prison, it was a mirror, reflecting the darkest parts of the wizarding government itself. And as the Ministry grew more comfortable with its shadowy tools, it began to look for other ways to categorize and control its citizens. The next step in this long descent would be the creation of a registry, a list of names that would divide the magical world more sharply than any curse ever could. The Pure Blood Directory was not a prison, but it was a cage of a different kind, one built from ink and prejudice, and it would set the stage for conflicts that would tear the wizarding world apart. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The Ministry had just turned a fortress of despair into a prison, and the Dementors were now official employees of the state. It was a dark compromise, a decision that traded moral clarity for the illusion of control. But while the Ministry was busy locking away criminals, a far more insidious form of darkness was taking root. Not in the cells of Azkaban, but in the drawing rooms and libraries of the most powerful families in magical Britain. This was the age of the pedigree, the century of the bloodline, and it would give rise to a poison that would linger long after the last Dementor was dismissed. The 18th century was an era of obsessive documentation. Wizarding families, having spent generations hiding from Muggles, began to turn inward. They started to ask a dangerous question. What made them truly different? Was it simply the ability to perform magic? Or was there something deeper, something inherent in their very blood? This was not a philosophical debate held in quiet academic circles. It was a social movement, a fever that swept through the pure blood elite. They began to trace their lineages with a religious fervour, commissioning elaborate family trees, compiling dusty tomes of ancestral deeds, and most importantly, drawing a line between themselves and everyone else. This was the birth of the concept of the Sacred 28. The term itself is a chilling artifact of the era. It was a list, compiled by an anonymous genealogist, of 28 families that were considered to be truly pure-blooded, meaning they had no known Muggle ancestry. The list was not a simple census, it was a declaration of worth. To be on the list was to be part of an exclusive club, a genetic aristocracy. To be off it was to be tainted, diminished. The names on that list are still whispered with a mixture of pride and shame today. The Malfoys, the Blacks, the Longbottoms, the Weasleys. Yes, the Weasleys were on that list. A fact that makes their later reputation as blood traitors all the more ironic and painful. They were pure by birth, but they rejected the ideology that the list represented. But the obsession with genealogy was not just about pride, it was about power. The pure blood families realized that if they could control the definition of magical legitimacy, they could control the future of the wizarding world. They began to weaponize blood status, turning it into a political tool to marginalize Muggle-borns. The argument was deceptively simple. They claimed that magic was a hereditary trait, passed down through bloodlines like a noble title. If a witch or wizard was born to Muggle parents, they argued, that magic must have been stolen, or it was a fluke, an anomaly that diluted the purity of the magical race. This was a lie, of course. Magic is not a finite resource. It does not weaken when shared, but lies are powerful when they serve the interests of the powerful. The rhetoric grew more aggressive. Muggle-borns were called mudbloods, a term that was meant to evoke filth and contamination. They were accused of being spies for the Muggle world, of being unable to truly understand or respect magical traditions. The Ministry, still finding its footing as a governing body, did little to stop this. In fact, many Ministry officials were themselves from pure-blood families, and they quietly supported the social hierarchy that elevated their own status. Laws were passed that favoured old money and old names. Positions of power were handed down through family connections, rather than merit. The wizarding world was slowly being stratified, divided not by skill or wisdom, but by the accident of birth. And in the shadows of this public discrimination, secret societies began to form. These were not the Death Eaters of Voldemort's era, not yet. They were more subtle, more insidious. They called themselves things like the Knights of Walpurgis, or the Society for the Preservation of Magical Heritage. They met in candlelit rooms, behind locked doors, in the ancestral homes of the oldest families. Their purpose was to preserve what they saw as the true magical heritage, which meant keeping it out of the hands of those they deemed unworthy. They collected dark artifacts. They experimented with forbidden rituals, and they shared information on how to keep their bloodlines pure. They whispered about arranged marriages between cousins to keep the magic strong, and they quietly eliminated any evidence of Muggle ancestry in their own family trees. This was the environment that shaped the next generation of wizards. Children born into these families were taught from the cradle that they were superior. They were taught to look down on Muggles with contempt and to view Muggle-borns with suspicion. They were taught that their blood was their most valuable possession, and for those who resisted, who questioned the dogma, there was a heavy price to pay. To be a blood traitor was to be cast out, disowned, erased from the family tapestry. The pressure to conform was immense, and it created a culture of fear and secrecy that would fester for centuries. The obsession with genealogy reached its peak in the late 18th century, but its effects never truly faded. The Sacred 28 became a symbol of a divided world, a world where your worth was determined before you could even speak. The secret societies that formed during this time laid the groundwork for the organized terror that would come later. They were the training ground for the ideology of pure blood supremacy. They were the libraries where the dark arts were preserved and passed down, and they were the breeding ground for a family. To its most horrifying conclusion, for among the names on that list, there was one family that was already beginning to decay from within, a family that had once been proud and powerful, but had retreated into isolation and bitterness, a family that clung to their blood status as their only remaining treasure, even as they sank into poverty and madness. That family was the Gaunts, and their story is the next chapter in this long, dark history. They were the living proof of what happens when the obsession with purity becomes a sickness, when the fear of contamination destroys everything it was meant to protect. The Gaunts were waiting, hidden in their shack, holding the last relic of their founder and nursing a hatred that would one day burn down the world. The previous chapter traced how the Sacred 28 transformed blood status from a simple observation into a weapon. That list, published in the early 1930s, codified which families were considered truly pure. But what the directory never mentioned was that some of the most ancient bloodlines had already begun to rot from within. The names that once commanded respect were crumbling into dust. and the most dramatic collapse was happening in a ramshackle hut on the outskirts of Little Hangleton. To understand the Gaunt family, you have to go back further than the Sacred 28. You have to go back to the Peverells, the original possessors of the Deathly Hallows. Antioch, Cadmus, and Ignotus Peverell were the three brothers from the tale, and their bloodline carried a strange, almost cursed weight. The Resurrection Stone, the object that could summon the shades of the dead, passed down through Cadmus Peverell's line. For generations that stone was a secret, an heirloom whispered about in hushed tones. But secrets have a way of corroding the families that keep them. The Peverell line eventually merged with the Gaunts, a family that claimed direct descent from Salazar Slytherin himself. On paper, this was the most prestigious lineage in the wizarding world. In reality, it was a slow-motion tragedy. The Gaunts had once been wealthy, powerful, and respected, but by the late 19th century, they had squandered everything. Their fortune was gone, their estate was lost, and they had retreated into a hovel that was little more than a shack with a fireplace. They lived in squalor, surrounded by relics of a past they could not let go of, and those relics were the problem. The Gaunts hoarded the artifacts of their ancestors like a dragon hoards gold. They kept Slytherin's locket, a heavy gold pendant that once belonged to the founder of Hogwarts. They kept the Resurrection Stone, set in a ring that bore the Peverell coat of arms. These objects were not just heirlooms, they were anchors to a lost world, and the Gaunts clung to them with a desperation that bordered on madness. The tragic decline of the Peverell and Slytherin lineages into poverty and madness was not a sudden fall. It was a slow erosion, generation after generation, fueled by inbreeding and an obsession with blood purity. The Gaunts married within the family to keep the line pure, and the result was a series of increasingly unstable individuals. They were violent, paranoid, and prone to fits of rage. They spoke Parseltongue, the language of snakes, and they wore their heritage like a crown, even as they lived in filth. The hoarding of ancient artifacts like the Resurrection Stone and Slytherin's locket became an obsession for Marvolo Gaunt, the patriarch of the family in the early 20th century. He would sit in that shack, polishing the locket and the ring, muttering about the glory of his ancestors. He believed that these objects proved his superiority. Even as his children went hungry, he was a man consumed by the past, and he passed that obsession on to his son, Morfinn, and his daughter Merope. Merope Gaunt was the tragic heart of this story. She was a young woman with no magic to speak of, or so it seemed. In a family that prized pure blood power above all else, Merope was considered a squib, a failure. Her father and brother tormented her, treating her as a servant in her own home. She was trapped in that shack, surrounded by the ghosts of Slytherin and Peverell, with no hope of escape. But Merope was not powerless. She was a witch, but her magic was suppressed by the abuse she endured. And when she fell in love with a muggle named Tom Riddle, a handsome young man from the manor up the hill, she saw her chance. She used a love potion to ensnare him, and they eloped. For a brief time, Merope believed she had escaped the Gaunt legacy. She was pregnant, and she thought that if she stopped using the potion, Tom might truly love her. He did not. When she stopped the potion, he abandoned her. Merope, heartbroken and destitute, sold Slytherin's locket for a pittance to a passing merchant. She died shortly after giving birth to her son, alone in a muggle orphanage on New Year's Eve, 1926. That son was Tom Marvolo Riddle, who would one day become Lord Voldemort. The toxic environment that would eventually produce the mother of Lord Voldemort was not just a single household. It was the culmination of centuries of decay. The Gaunts were the end of a line that had once been glorious, and their madness, their poverty, their obsession with blood purity, all of it was passed down to Merope, and through her, to her son. The Resurrection Stone and Slytherin's locket were not just artifacts. They were symbols of a dynasty that had collapsed under the weight of its own pride. And so the Gaunt dynasty rose and fell in obscurity. But their story did not end in that shack. The artifacts they hoarded would resurface in ways that would shape the darkest chapter of wizarding history. The locket would find its way into the hands of a young witch named Hepzibah Smith, and from there into the collection of a man who would become the most feared wizard of the 20th century. The ring, with its resurrection stone, would be hidden in the Gaunt shack, waiting for a descendant who understood its power. But before we follow those threads, we must turn our attention to a different kind of darkness. A darkness that did not fester in a forgotten shack, but rose like a storm across Europe. A wizard who believed that the wizarding world should not hide, but should conquer. A visionary who saw the Statute of Secrecy not as a shield, but as a cage. That story begins in a small village in the mountains, with a boy who dreamed of a world remade in his image. The Gaunt family's story is one of decay, but it is also a warning. It shows how obsession with blood and legacy can hollow out a lineage until nothing remains but bitterness and broken relics. Yet even as the Gaunts withered in their shack, a different kind of dark magic was stirring elsewhere in Europe. This was not the desperate hoarding of old artifacts by a fallen house. This was something far more ambitious, far more dangerous, and far more seductive. This was the rise of a visionary. Gellert Grindelwald was not born into poverty or madness. He was born into talent so immense that it caught the attention of Durmstrang Institute, a school known for its tolerance of the dark arts. But even Durmstrang, with its lenient attitude toward forbidden magic, had its limits. Grindelwald pushed past them. He was expelled not for mere rule-breaking, but for what the school called twisted experiments. The phrase is deliberately vague, and that vagueness is telling. What kind of experiments could shock a school that already taught students how to wield curses and summon dark creatures? The records are sparse, but the implication is clear. Grindelwald was not just experimenting with magic. He was experimenting with the boundaries of what magic could do to the human soul, to the natural order, and to the world itself. He was barely 16 years old when he was cast out, and like many outcasts, he found his way to a place where he could begin again. That place was Godric's Hollow, a village steeped in wizarding history, home to the legendary Godric Gryffindor himself. It was the summer of 1899, and the world was on the cusp of a new century. For Grindelwald, it was the beginning of everything. He arrived at his great-aunt Bathilda Bagshot's house, a renowned magical historian who lived in the heart of the village. Bathilda was old, eccentric, and deeply connected to the lore of the wizarding world. She was also the perfect cover for a young prodigy who needed a place to lay low. But Grindelwald had no intention of hiding. He was restless, brilliant, and burning with ideas that no one else seemed to understand. He spent his days wandering the village, reading forbidden texts from Bathilda's library, and sketching out a vision of the future that would reshape the entire magical world. And then he met Albus Dumbledore. Albus was also spending that summer in Godric's Hollow, trapped in the aftermath of his mother's death. He was burdened by the care of his troubled brother Aberforth and his fragile sister Ariana, whose magical instability had shattered their family. Albus was brilliant, yes, but he was also desperate. Desperate for escape. Desperate for purpose. Desperate for someone who could see the world the way he did. When he met Grindelwald, he found that the two young wizards became inseparable. They were equals in intellect, in ambition, and in their hunger for something greater than the mundane life that had been forced upon them. They talked for hours in the graveyard of Godric's Hollow, beneath the shadow of the church, about the nature of magic, the structure of society, and the future of the wizarding world. Grindelwald spoke of a new order, one where wizards would no longer hide from muggles, but would rule over them for their own good. He called it the greater good. That phrase, for the greater good, cornerstone of everything Grindelwald believed. It was not a simple desire for power, it was a philosophy, a justification, a moral framework that allowed him to see his darkest ambitions as noble sacrifices. He argued that wizards were naturally superior to muggles, not through blood, but through magic itself. And if wizards were superior, did they not have a responsibility to lead, to guide, to control? The greater good meant that any action, no matter how brutal, could be excused if it served the ultimate goal of magical supremacy. It was a seductive lie, and Albus Dumbledore, lonely and brilliant and desperate for meaning, believed it. They planned together, they dreamed together, they even made a pact, swearing an oath of blood to bind their fates. But the dream could not last. Aberforth, who saw what Grindelwald truly was, confronted them. A duel broke out, a chaotic and tragic clash of magic that ended with Ariana dead. The exact details of that night remain murky, but the result was clear: the friendship shattered. Grindelwald fled, and Dumbledore was left with a guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But Grindelwald did not abandon his vision. He took the philosophy of the greater good and turned it into a global movement. He gathered followers, built armies, and spread his ideology across Europe and beyond. He did not just want power, he wanted to transform the very fabric of magical society. He believed that the Statute of Secrecy was a cowardly retreat, that wizards had hidden from muggles for too long, and that the time had come for them to reclaim their rightful place as rulers of the world. His methods were ruthless. He used the Imperious Curse freely, turning enemies into puppets. He unleashed dark creatures on cities. He orchestrated attacks that killed hundreds, maybe thousands, all in the name of the greater good. But he was not a monster in the way that Voldemort would later become. Grindelwald was charismatic, persuasive, and genuinely believed that he was saving the world from itself. He saw himself as a liberator, not a tyrant, and that made him far more dangerous. For nearly 2 decades, he waged a shadow war against the magical governments of the world. He built a fortress at Nurmengard, a prison for his enemies, and inscribed above its gates the words that defined his entire life: for the greater good. But the world eventually pushed back. Albus Dumbledore, now a professor at Hogwarts and burdened by the guilt of his past, could no longer ignore the threat. In 1945, the two former friends finally faced each other in a legendary duel. It was not just a battle of magic. It was a battle of ideologies, of guilt, of broken promises and lost innocence. Dumbledore won. Grindelwald was captured and imprisoned in his own fortress, where he would remain for decades. But his influence did not die. The seeds he planted, the ideas he spread, the justifications he crafted for magical supremacy, they all lingered. They lingered in the minds of pure-blood families, in the rhetoric of the Death Eaters, and in the soul of Tom Riddle, who would take Grindelwald's philosophy and twist it into something even darker. Grindelwald was a visionary, yes, but his vision was a poison that infected the wizarding world for generations, and that poison would eventually lead to a war unlike any the magical world had ever seen. A war that would not be fought in shadows or secret councils, but in the open, across continents, with the fate of every wizard and muggle hanging in the balance. That war is the subject of our next chapter, the Global Wizarding War. The summer in Godric's Hollow had ended, and with it, any hope that Gellert Grindelwald might be contained by the bonds of friendship or the moral compass of Albus Dumbledore. The vision they had shared, that grand and terrible dream of a new world order, had shattered not because the dream was abandoned, but because one of them had drawn a line. Ariana Dumbledore lay in the ground, and Albus retreated into a lifetime of guilt and duty. Grindelwald, however, did not retreat. He ran, and when he stopped running, he began to build. The wizarding world of the 1920s was a fractured place, still reeling from the Great War that had scarred the Muggle world and left magical communities across Europe wary and isolated. Into that vacuum of fear and uncertainty stepped a man who promised order. Grindelwald did not present himself as a tyrant. He presented himself as a revolutionary, a liberator who understood that the Statute of Secrecy was not a protection but a cage. He argued that wizards were meant to rule, that they had hidden for too long, and that the only path to true greatness was to cast off the chains of secrecy. and take their rightful place as masters of a world that feared what it did not understand. It was a seductive message, and it spread like wildfire. Grindelwald began his expansion not with armies, but with words. He travelled from country to country, speaking in hushed salons and grand assembly halls, gathering followers who believed in his cause with a fervour that bordered on religious devotion. He recruited an international army not by force, but by conviction. Witches and wizards from Germany, France, Scandinavia, and beyond flocked to his banner. They were not all dark wizards in the traditional sense. Many were idealists who genuinely believed that wizardkind had been wronged. Others were power-hungry opportunists who saw in Grindelwald a chance to rise above their station. And some were simply afraid, and he offered them the comfort of belonging to something larger than themselves. As his following grew, so did his need for a base of operations. He needed a place where his followers could train, where his plans could be forged in secret, and where his enemies could be silenced. He found it in a remote alpine fortress, a stark and brutal structure carved into the mountains of an unnamed European nation. He called it Nurmengard. The name itself would become a whisper of dread across the magical world. But Grindelwald was not building a prison for his enemies. At least not at first. He built it as a headquarters, a symbol of his power. The walls were enchanted with protections so ancient and so vicious that even the most skilled aurors dared not approach. It was a place where the air felt heavy, where the very stones seemed to remember the dark magic that had been poured into its foundations. And yet, as his movement grew more aggressive, Nurmengard's purpose shifted. Those who opposed Grindelwald, who spoke out against his ideology or attempted to thwart his plans, began to disappear. They were not killed. That would have been too merciful and too public. They were taken to Nurmengard, where they were imprisoned in cells that were not merely locked, but warded against hope itself. The fortress became a prison for his political enemies, a place where dissent was not punished with death, but with eternal isolation. The walls of Nurmengard were built to hold more than bodies. They were built to hold the very spirit of resistance. By 1927, Grindelwald's influence had reached a fever pitch. He had amassed a following that spanned continents, and his agents moved through the shadows of every major wizarding capital. The International Confederation of Wizards, the governing body that had once dismissed him as a radical with a silver tongue, now realized they were facing a threat that could not be reasoned with. But it was too late. Grindelwald had already set his sights on a target that would send a message to the entire world. Paris, the city of lights, the heart of European magical culture, was about to become a stage for the most terrifying display of power the modern wizarding world had ever seen. Grindelwald's objective was not conquest, not yet. It was demonstration. He wanted to show the world that no place was safe, that no government could protect its citizens, and that the only path to survival was to join him. He orchestrated an attack that was less a battle and more a cataclysm. The streets of Paris were torn apart by magical fire. Buildings crumbled. The sky turned a sickly green as spells of destruction rained down from unseen hands. Wizards and witches fled in terror, and muggles, who could not see the source of the chaos, felt only the ground shake and the air burn. In the midst of that devastation, Grindelwald was hunting something specific. He was hunting an obscurial. An obscurial is a rare and tragic creature, a parasitic force born from a magical child who has been forced to suppress their own nature. The child does not die, not exactly. Instead, their magic turns inward, festering into a dark, uncontrolled entity that lashes out with devastating force. Grindelwald saw the obscurial not as a victim, but as a weapon. He believed that if he could capture and control one, he would have a force of nature at his command, a living storm that could level cities. The hunt for obscurials had been a constant thread in Grindelwald's rise. He had been searching for them for years, tracking rumors of magical children who had been abused or hidden away by terrified families. The near destruction of Paris was not an accident. It was a trap, a desperate attempt to draw out the most powerful obscurial he had ever encountered. The battle that followed was not a duel in the traditional sense. It was a collision of raw, untamed magic against Grindelwald's calculated cruelty. The streets of Paris became a war zone, and the cost was measured in lives and in the shattered trust of the magical public. In the aftermath, the world finally understood what Grindelwald was capable of. The International Confederation of Wizards declared him the most wanted wizard in history. Nations that had remained neutral began to arm themselves. The hunt for obscurials escalated, not just by Grindelwald's followers, but by governments desperate to keep such weapons out of his hands. The magical world was no longer a place of hidden peace. It was a battlefield, and the war had only just begun. Grindelwald retreated to Nurmengard, not in defeat, but to consolidate his power. He had shown the world what he could do. And now he would wait for the world to come to him. The prison that had once held his enemies now became his throne room. He stood at the center of his fortress, surrounded by his most loyal followers, and he looked out at a world that was finally paying attention. He knew that the next move would not be his, it would be the world's response, and he was ready. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the age, a duel that would be spoken of in hushed tones for generations to come. The greatest wizard of the age, Albus Dumbledore, had spent years avoiding this moment, haunted by the memory of a summer in Godric's Hollow and a sister lost. But the world could not wait forever. The war was coming to a head, and the only question that remained was whether Dumbledore would finally face the man he had once called a friend. The answer would come in 1945, in a duel that would decide the fate of the magical world. By the time Grindelwald's shadow stretched across all of Europe, the world had become a stage for a confrontation that had been decades in the making. The global wizarding war had not been a single battle, but a slow, creeping suffocation. Nations fell not to armies of dark wizards alone, but to ideology. The seductive promise of a new order where the magical ruled openly, and the Muggles were subjugated for their own good. Nurmengard, Grindelwald's fortress prison, stood as a monument to his philosophy. A place where he locked away those who opposed his vision, and from which he orchestrated the transformation of the magical world. But every empire has its breaking point, and for Grindelwald, that point had a name he had not spoken in love for nearly 50 years. Albus Dumbledore. The duel that was to come was not merely a clash of spells. It was the culmination of a broken friendship, a shattered romance, and a debt of guilt that Dumbledore had carried since the death of his sister, Ariana. For years, Dumbledore had refused to face Grindelwald. He knew that if he did, he would have to confront not only his former friend, but the boy he himself had once been. The ambitious, reckless teenager who had dreamed of ruling the world alongside Gellert. That dream had ended in tragedy, in a three-way duel that had claimed Ariana's life, and Dumbledore had buried the memory along with his sister. But Grindelwald's war had grown too large to ignore. The magical world was burning, and only Dumbledore could stop it. The psychological toll on Dumbledore as he faced his former friend and lover was immense. This was not a battle against a faceless enemy. It was a battle against a mirror. Grindelwald knew Dumbledore's mind, his weaknesses, his regrets. He knew the exact words to wound, the memories to resurrect. And Dumbledore, for all his brilliance, had to fight not only the most powerful dark wizard of the age, but the ghost of his own ambition. Every spell he cast was a denial of the path he had once chosen. Every parry was a rejection of the ideology he had once found intoxicating. The duel was as much an exorcism as it was a war. The legendary 3-hour duel that reshaped the magical map of the world took place in 1945, in a remote location known only to the participants. The exact site has never been confirmed, but the aftermath was visible to any wizard who cared to look. The ground was scarred, the air thick with residual magic for years afterward. Spells of such complexity and power were unleashed that they defied the known laws of magic. Transfigurations that should have been impossible were woven into the very fabric of the battlefield. The duel was not a simple exchange of curses. It was a masterclass in magical theory, a symphony of destruction and creation that left the landscape forever altered. As the hours wore on, Grindelwald's power began to wane. He had spent decades building an empire, but Dumbledore had spent those same decades mastering his own demons. The Elder Wand, which Grindelwald had stolen from Gregorovitch decades earlier, was the most powerful wand in existence, but its allegiance was fickle. It did not belong to the one who held it, but to the one who had defeated its previous master, and Grindelwald, for all his conquests, had never truly earned its loyalty. He had taken it by theft, not by victory, and now facing Dumbledore, the wand began to sense a shift. The fall of Grindelwald and the transfer of the Elder Wand's allegiance happened in a single decisive moment. Dumbledore disarmed him, and in that instant, the wand's loyalty transferred. Grindelwald was not killed. Dumbledore, despite everything, could not bring himself to kill the man he had once loved. Instead, he bound him, and Grindelwald was taken to Nurmengard, his own prison, to spend the rest of his days in isolation. It was a poetic, tragic end. The visionary who had dreamed of ruling the world was now a prisoner in his own fortress, a monument to his failure. The Elder Wand, now loyal to Dumbledore, became a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. He knew its history, its bloody trail. He feared the power it represented. He did not wield it openly, but kept it hidden, hoping that its allegiance would die with him. But the wand does not forget, and its story was far from over. As the dust settled on the battlefield, Dumbledore returned to Hogwarts, older, wearier, and more isolated than ever. He had saved the world, but at the cost of his last remaining illusions. The boy who had dreamed of power was gone, replaced by a man who understood that some victories leave scars that never heal. And as he walked the halls of the castle, he could not help but think of the other dark cloud gathering on the horizon. A boy born in the depths of winter, in a cold, unfeeling orphanage. A boy who would one day carry the name Tom Riddle. A boy who had already begun to ask the wrong questions. And in the quiet of his office, Dumbledore wondered if he had the strength to face another war. The answer, he knew, was not one he wanted to hear. But history does not ask for permission. It simply moves forward toward the next chapter, the next tragedy, the next Orphan of Wools. The duel that ended Grindelwald's reign sent shockwaves through the magical world. But even as Dumbledore stood victorious in the ruins of Nurmengard, a different kind of darkness was already taking root in the most unassuming of places. While the Ministry celebrated the defeat of Europe's greatest threat, a woman named Merope Gaunt sat alone in a Muggle London orphanage, pregnant and abandoned, her magic fading like a candle starved of air. Merope had traded everything for love, or what she believed was love. She had drugged Tom Riddle Sr., a wealthy Muggle from Little Hangleton, with a love potion, forcing him to elope with her. For a few months, she tasted the life she had always dreamed of, a life free from her father's cruelty and her brother's violence. But the potion could not sustain what was never real. When its effects wore off, Tom Riddle Sr. woke to find himself married to a woman he despised, a woman he had never truly chosen. He left her without a word, returning to his family home and the comfortable lie that he had been tricked into disgrace. Merope, pregnant and penniless, made her way to London. She arrived at the door of Wool's orphanage on New Year's Eve, 1926, with nothing but a locket that held no warmth and a belly that held the last heir of Salazar Slytherin. She had stopped using magic entirely. Perhaps she believed it had failed her, or perhaps she simply no longer had the will to perform it. The matron of Wools, Mrs. Cole, would later describe Merope as a strange, hollow-eyed woman who spoke little and seemed to be waiting for something that would never come. On the 31st of December 1926, Merope Gaunt gave birth to a son. She named him Tom Marvolo Riddle, after the father who had abandoned her and the grandfather who had disowned her. Then within the hour she died. The official cause was complications from childbirth, but those who knew The Gaunt family history might have whispered something else. Marip had willed herself to stop living. She had poured all her remaining strength into bringing the child into the world, and once that task was complete, she simply let go. The boy was left in the care of Wool's orphanage, a grim grey building that smelled of boiled cabbage and disinfectant. It was the kind of place where children learned quickly that no one was coming to save them. The matrons were overworked and indifferent, the older children cruel, and the younger ones desperate for any scrap of attention. Into this cold, magicless environment, Tom Riddle was placed, a child who carried the blood of two ancient magical lines, but who would grow up believing he was utterly alone in the world. From the very beginning, Tom was different. He was a beautiful baby, with dark hair and a solemn expression that seemed far too knowing for an infant. The matrons noted that he rarely cried. He would lie in his cot, staring at the ceiling with an unsettling stillness, as if he were waiting for something to happen. As he grew into a toddler, that stillness gave way to a quiet, watchful intensity. He did not play with the other children. He observed them, studying their weaknesses and their fears, with a patience that was deeply unnatural for a child his age. By the time Tom was 5, the other children had learned to avoid him. Strange things happened when he was angry. A boy who shoved him in the hallway would find himself inexplicably choking on air. A girl who stole his toy would wake up the next morning with her hair hacked off. Though no one had seen Tom leave his bed, the matrons dismissed these incidents as accidents or exaggerations. But the children knew better. They whispered that Tom Riddle was cursed, that he had something wrong with him, something that made bad things happen to anyone who crossed him. Tom himself did not understand what was happening. He knew only that when he felt a surge of anger or fear, something inside him would twist, and the world would bend to his will. He learned to control these episodes, not because he was taught, but because he was driven by a desperate need to never be vulnerable again. He began to experiment, testing the limits of this strange power. He discovered that he could make things move without touching them, that he could make animals do what he wanted, that he could inflict pain on others simply by willing it, and he enjoyed it. That was the first true sign of what Tom Riddle would become, not the accidental magic, which was common enough in young witches and wizards, but the pleasure he took in using it. He did not use his power to protect himself or to help others. He used it to dominate, to punish, to prove that he was superior to the miserable creatures around him. He was a predator in a world of prey, and he knew it. When Tom turned 11, a visitor arrived at Wool's orphanage. Professor Albus Dumbledore, then the Transfiguration teacher at Hogwarts, had come to inform Tom that he was a wizard and to offer him a place at the school. Dumbledore had expected to find a frightened, confused child, a boy who had been isolated and misunderstood because of his abilities. What he found instead was something far more troubling. Tom Riddle was not frightened. He was not confused. He was curious, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth. He greeted Dumbledore with a cold, measured politeness that felt more like a performance than genuine courtesy. He asked questions not out of wonder, but out of a desire to understand how this new world could serve him. He spoke of his ability to make things happen, to hurt people who angered him, as if it were a natural and justified right. Dumbledore watched the boy's eyes as he spoke. They were dark and flat, like the surface of a frozen lake. There was no joy in them, no fear, no hint of the innocence that should have lingered in a child who had just discovered he belonged to a hidden world of magic. Instead, there was only a cold, calculating hunger. As Dumbledore prepared to leave, he asked Tom if he had any questions about Hogwarts. Tom paused, then asked something that chilled Dumbledore to the bone. He asked if the boy in the story, the one who had spoken to snakes, was related to him. Tom had heard whispers of his mother's family, the Gaunts, and their connection to Salazar Slytherin. He had already begun to piece together the puzzle of his own origins, and he was not satisfied with the answer he had found. Dumbledore told him the truth, that he was indeed the heir of Slytherin, but he warned him that Hogwarts was a place where one's choices defined them, not their blood. Tom listened politely, but Dumbledore could see that the warning had not landed. The boy's mind was already racing ahead, calculating how this new identity could be used, how this legacy could be weaponized. As Dumbledore walked away from Wool's orphanage that day, he felt a weight settle in his chest. He had seen darkness before. He had faced Grindelwald, had watched his sister die, had carried the guilt of 1,000 mistakes. But this was different. This was a darkness that had not yet been shaped, a potential that could still be guided toward the light. And yet, as he looked back at the grim grey building, he knew that he had just met the boy who would become his greatest failure. Tom Marvolo Riddle would enter Hogwarts not as a student seeking knowledge, but as a conqueror seeking a kingdom. And in the halls of the castle that had once been a refuge for the magical world, he would find the tools he needed to build his empire of terror. But before that, he would need to understand the secrets of the Chamber of Secrets, the whispers of the basilisk, and the legacy of the Heir of Slytherin. That story, the story of how a boy became a monster, is one that would unfold in the shadows of Hogwarts, where the ghosts of the past still lingered, and the future of the wizarding world hung in the balance. From the cold, unfeeling corridors of Wool's orphanage, Tom Riddle's journey carried him to a place that would become both his sanctuary and his stage, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. But this was no simple story of a boy discovering magic. This was the beginning of a calculated ascent, one that would reshape the very foundations of the wizarding world. When Tom Riddle first arrived at Hogwarts, he was not merely a student seeking knowledge. He was a predator entering a new hunting ground. The faculty, seasoned witches and wizards who could see generations of young minds bloom, were utterly unprepared for what stood before them. Here was a boy who had already learned to weaponize his silence, to use his charm as a blade, and to read the weaknesses of adults with an instinct that bordered on the supernatural. Tom's obsession with his ancestry began almost immediately. He devoured the history of Hogwarts, searching for traces of greatness in his bloodline. The name Riddle meant nothing in the magical world, a fact that gnawed at him like a wound that would not heal. But then he discovered the truth. He was not merely a riddle. He was the heir of Salazar Slytherin, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, a wizard who believed that magical blood should be kept pure and that Muggle-born students were unworthy of learning the ancient arts. This revelation was not a gentle discovery. It was a detonation. Tom Riddle, the boy who had been told he was nothing, who had been locked in a cupboard for his strangeness, who had been feared and reviled by the very adults who were supposed to protect him, now knew that he was descended from one of the most powerful and feared wizards in history. The knowledge did not humble him. It did not inspire gratitude. It ignited a cold, burning certainty that he was destined for greatness, that the world owed him a debt for the years of neglect and cruelty. And so, Tom began to manipulate the faculty with a precision that would have been chilling in a fully grown wizard, let alone a boy of 11. He studied his professors the way a general studies an enemy army. He learned which teachers were susceptible to flattery, which ones could be swayed by a show of humility, and which ones were too distracted by their own concerns to notice the darkness growing in their midst. Professor Dippet, the headmaster, was an easy target. Tom presented himself as a model student, diligent, respectful, and eager to learn. He never raised his voice, never broke the rules in plain sight, and always had a plausible excuse for any minor transgression. The faculty saw what they wanted to see: a brilliant, troubled boy who had risen above his difficult beginnings. They did not see the predator who was cataloguing their weaknesses for future use. But it was Professor Slughorn who became Tom's most valuable tool. Slughorn was a collector of promising students, a man who surrounded himself with the future elite of the wizarding world. Tom recognized this hunger for association and fed it expertly. He became Slughorn's favorite, the star pupil who could answer any question, who showed a particular talent for potions, and who seemed to understand the importance of connections and influence. It was in Slughorn's presence that Tom first began to probe the boundaries of dark magic. He asked questions that were just innocent enough to seem academic, but just pointed enough to reveal his true interests. What happens when a wizard splits their soul? Is it possible to cheat death? Can magic create life? Slughorn, blinded by his affection for his star pupil, answered these questions without realizing he was planting seeds that would grow into a forest of horrors. Tom's manipulation extended beyond the faculty. He began to gather followers among the students, selecting those who were ambitious, impressionable, or simply afraid of him. He did not need to threaten them openly. His presence alone was enough. There was something in his eyes, a coldness that promised retribution for disloyalty, that made even the bravest students hesitate to cross him. And all the while, Tom was searching. He searched the restricted section of the library for any mention of Salazar Slytherin, for any hint of the secrets the founder had left behind. He searched the castle itself, wandering its corridors at night, listening to the whispers of the stone and the echoes of ancient magic. He knew that Slytherin had built something hidden within Hogwarts, a chamber that would only open to his true heir, and Tom was determined to find it. It took him 5 years. 5 years of patient research, of decoding clues hidden in old texts, of listening to the castle's secrets. And then, in his 5th year, Tom Riddle found the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets. He spoke parcel tongue, the language of serpents, the same language that Salazar Slytherin had spoken. The entrance opened before him, and he descended into the darkness. What he found there was more than a chamber. He found a basilisk, a monstrous serpent that had been sleeping beneath Hogwarts for centuries. The basilisk was a weapon of immense power, a creature whose very gaze could kill, and Tom Riddle, the heir of Slytherin, could control it. The opening of the Chamber of Secrets was not an act of random violence. It was a statement. Tom wanted to prove that he was worthy of his heritage, that he could wield the power that Slytherin had left behind. He wanted to purge the school of those he considered unworthy. The Muggle-born students who, in his mind, had no right to learn magic. The first attack was subtle. A cat misses. Norris was found petrified in a corridor. The school was alarmed, but no one suspected the truth. The attacks continued. Students were found frozen, their bodies stiff and lifeless, their eyes wide with terror. The faculty was baffled. They had no idea what was causing these attacks, and they had no idea who was responsible. And then came the death of Myrtle Warren. Myrtle was a Muggle-born student, a shy and lonely girl who often hid in the bathroom to escape the taunts of her classmates. On that fateful day, she heard a voice in the pipes, a voice that whispered in parcel tongue. She followed it, curious and frightened, and found herself face to face with the basilisk. The creature's gaze was deadly. Myrtle Warren died in an instant, her body crumpling to the floor of the bathroom. The school was thrown into chaos. The Ministry of Magic was called in, and the hunt for the culprit began. But Tom Riddle was too clever to be caught. He had already planned his escape. He needed a scapegoat, someone who could be blamed for the attacks, someone who would never be believed if they tried to tell the truth. He chose Rubeus Hagrid. Hagrid was a gentle giant, a half-giant, who loved magical creatures more than he loved most people. He was also an easy target. He was loud, clumsy, and not particularly clever. Tom knew that the faculty and the ministry would be eager to close the case, to find someone to blame, so that the school could return to normal. Tom framed Hagrid by planting a dangerous creature, an acromantula, in the castle. He then anonymously tipped off the ministry, claiming that Hagrid was the one who had opened the Chamber of Secrets. The ministry, desperate for a resolution, seized on the accusation. Hagrid was expelled from Hogwarts. His wand was snapped, and he was forbidden from ever using magic again. But the truth was far darker. Tom Riddle had not only opened the Chamber of Secrets and killed Myrtle Warren, he had also created a Horcrux, a piece of his soul that he had hidden within a diary. The diary was a weapon in itself, a tool that could possess others and continue his work long after he had left Hogwarts. The faculty never suspected the truth. They saw Tom as a hero, a student who had helped them uncover the culprit. They awarded him a special commendation for his service to the school, and Tom smiled, accepted the praise, and began to plan his next move. He had learned that power was not just about magic. It was about influence, about manipulation, about knowing when to strike and when to retreat. He had learned that the wizarding world was full of people who were eager to believe the easiest explanation, who would rather close a case than seek the truth. And he had learned that his heritage was not just a source of pride, it was a weapon. The name Slytherin carried weight, fear, and respect. Tom Riddle was no longer just an orphan from Wools. He was the heir of Slytherin, and he was just beginning to understand what that meant. The Chamber of Secrets would remain closed for decades, its secrets buried beneath the castle, but the diary remained, a fragment of Tom's soul, waiting for the day when it would be found again. And Tom himself would continue his journey, moving from the halls of Hogwarts to the shadows of the wizarding world, building his power, creating his Horcruxes, and preparing for the war that would define his legacy. But before he could become Lord Voldemort, before he could unleash the terror that would shake the wizarding world to its core, Tom Riddle had to complete his transformation. He had to split his soul not once, but 7 times, creating a network of anchors that would bind him to life even in death. This was the path of the sevenfold soul, a journey into the darkest depths of magic, where the boundaries of humanity were crossed and the price of immortality was paid in blood. Tom Riddle had accomplished what no student at Hogwarts had dared in centuries. He had unlocked the Chamber of Secrets, commanded the Basilisk, and orchestrated the death of a Muggle-born girl named Myrtle Warren. And he had done it all while remaining beyond suspicion, a model student in every teacher's eyes, except perhaps for one. But the truth was that the chamber had not satisfied his hunger. It had only sharpened it. Riddle had tasted the power of ancient magic, and now he wanted something far more permanent. He wanted to conquer death itself. When he left Hogwarts with a glittering awards record and a reputation as the most brilliant student in decades, he already knew where his research would lead. He had read the restricted section. He had studied the darkest tomes in the school library, and he had found references to a forbidden branch of magic that could anchor a soul to the world beyond the grave. But these texts were deliberately vague, their secrets buried in hints and warnings. To learn the full truth, Riddle needed a guide, someone who knew the inner workings of such magic, but who would never willingly share it. That guide was Horace Slughorn. Slughorn had always collected promising students, the way some people collect rare artifacts. He admired ambition, talent, and lineage, and Riddle possessed all three. Over the years, the potions master had grown fond of the orphan boy from Wools, taking him under his wing and inviting him to the exclusive Slug Club dinners. Riddle played his role flawlessly, charming the old wizard with questions about famous alumni and dark history, always careful to appear curious rather than obsessive. But after leaving Hogwarts, Riddle knew he needed something more than charm. He needed Slughorn to reveal the mechanism of a technique that was spoken of only in whispers. The Horcrux was during a private conversation, perhaps in Slughorn's office after a dinner, that Riddle pressed him. He framed it as a hypothetical, a thought exercise about how many times a wizard could split their soul. Slughorn, perhaps blinded by pride in his star pupil, let down his guard. He explained that a soul could be split once, maybe twice, but that the process was monstrous, and that no sane wizard would attempt it more than that. But Riddle was not satisfied. He leaned in and asked the question that would haunt Slughorn for the rest of his life. What about 7? Could a wizard create 7 Horcruxes, splitting the soul into 7 pieces? Slughorn's blood ran cold. He realized in that moment that he was not talking to a curious student. He was talking to a future monster. He tried to laugh it off, dismiss the idea as nonsense, and change the subject. but the memory of that conversation burned in his mind, and he would later hide it away, altering his own recollection to protect himself from the guilt. Riddle, however, had gotten what he needed. The theory was sound. The only remaining question was how many murders he would need to commit, and so the path was set. Riddle vanished from the public eye for several years, travelling, acquiring dark objects, and perfecting the craft of murder. He visited Borgin and Burke's, the sinister shop in Nocturne Alley, and there he ingratiated himself with the old owner, learning the trade of cursed artifacts while searching for objects worthy of holding fragments of his soul. But his most crucial theft came from a woman named Hepzibah Smith. Hepzibah was a wealthy, elderly witch who claimed descent from Helga Hufflepuff. She was gullible and vain, and she loved to show off her treasures, particularly two inherited heirlooms, a small golden cup that had once belonged to Hufflepuff herself, and a heavy locket that was said to belong to Salazar Slytherin. Riddle, now calling himself Lord Voldemort in private circles, visited her home under the guise of purchasing antiques for Borgin and Burke's. She was flattered by the attention of the handsome young man, and she eagerly displayed her prizes. He smiled, admired the cup, and asked to see the locket. And then, with a cold deficiency that betrayed no emotion, he killed her. He made it look like an accident, a natural death that her house elf would be blamed for. And he walked away with the Hufflepuff cup and the Slytherin locket, two vessels that would soon be defiled by the darkest magic imaginable. But the price of creating multiple Horcruxes was not just murder. It was a slow corrosion of the self. Each time Riddle tore his soul and sealed a piece into an object, he lost something of his humanity. His handsome features began to transform. His skin grew pale, almost waxy. His eyes took on a reddish gleam, and his face started to lose its symmetry, as if the structure of his own body was reflecting the fracture within. He became less Tom Riddle and more a name, a mask, a shadow of what a wizard should be. The sevenfold soul was not a triumph. It was a chain of mutilations, each link binding him closer to a half-life of eternal hunger. By the time he had created his first Horcrux, the diary, he was already unrecognizable to those who had known him at Hogwarts. The voice remained smooth and persuasive, but the face now carried a reptilian coldness. His followers began to gather, drawn by his power and his promises. They called him the Dark Lord, and they were eager to serve. The seeds of the Death Eaters were being sown, and the world would soon know the terror of a wizard who had chosen to unmake himself rather than face the end of his story. But before that army could rise, before the First War could begin, Voldemort had one more piece of his great plan to put into motion, and it would require a betrayal so intimate that it would echo through the halls of Hogwarts for decades to come. That story belongs to the next chapter, the moment when the Death Eaters were born from blood and loyalty, and when the Dark Lord's inner circle was forged in fire. By the time Tom Riddle left Hepzibah Smith's home with the Hufflepuff cup and the Slytherin locket hidden beneath his robes, he had already crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The murder of Hepzibah was not merely another step in his Horcrux creation. It was a public declaration that he was no longer a shadow lurking in the corridors of Borgin and Burke's. He had become something else entirely. Within hours, the Ministry would find her body, and suspicion would fall on her house elf. But the whispers would spread among those who knew the old pure-blood families. The name Tom Riddle began to carry a weight that was not just feared, but admired by the right sort of people. But Tom Riddle was already shedding that name like a serpent's skin. He had chosen a new title, a name that would strike terror into the hearts of his enemies and inspire devotion in his followers, Lord Voldemort. And with this new identity came the need for an organization, a force that would serve not merely as a collection of dark wizards, but as an extension of his will. What had once been a loose gathering of disgruntled pure-bloods, calling themselves the Knights of Walpurgis, would now be forged into something far more disciplined, far more dangerous. The Knights of Walpurgis had been a small circle of Slytherin alumni and like-minded aristocrats who shared a common disgust for Muggle-borns and a reverence for the old ways. They met in dimly lit drawing rooms, discussing blood purity and the decline of magical society over crystal glasses of fire whiskey. They were at first nothing more than a social club for the disenfranchised elite, but Voldemort saw their potential. He understood that ideology without structure is just a conversation. What he needed was an army, and so the transformation began. The Knights of Walpurgis were summoned to a gathering in a place that would become infamous in the years to come. A vast, decaying manor house hidden from Muggle eyes, its grounds overgrown with dark shrubs, and its interior lit only by candlelight. There Voldemort stood before them, not as a former classmate or a fellow pureblood, but as a figure of absolute authority. He spoke of a new order, a world where those of true magical blood would no longer hide, no longer answer to the Ministry's weak laws. He promised them power, not just over Muggles and Muggle-borns, but over the very fabric of the magical world. And in return he demanded one thing: total unquestioning loyalty. This was the birth of the Death Eaters. No longer a club, no longer a discussion group. They became a paramilitary cult, bound not by friendship or shared ideals alone, but by fear and the intoxicating promise of dominion. Voldemort understood that loyalty could not be ensured through mere words. It had to be written into their very flesh. So he gave them the Dark Mark. The mark was not just a symbol, it was a curse, a brand, a tether. Each Death Eater knelt before their master and felt the burning agony of the skull and serpent seared into their left forearm. The pain was deliberate. It was a reminder that they belonged to him, body and soul. The mark allowed Voldemort to summon them at will, to feel their presence, to punish them from miles away. It was a binding spell that went deeper than any oath. To bear the Dark Mark was to accept that your life was no longer your own, and for those who gave themselves to him, that loss of self was precisely the point. Psychologically, the branding was a masterstroke. It created a permanent visual marker of belonging, a secret sign that separated the initiated from the ordinary. In public, a Death Eater could roll down his sleeve and appear as any other wizard. But at night, in secret meetings, the mark would glow, black against pale skin, and they would feel a thrill of terror and pride. It was a constant reminder that they were part of something far greater than themselves, something that demanded their absolute obedience. And for those who wavered, the mark became a source of dread. Voldemort could touch it, and they would feel the agony as if his fingers were pressing into their very minds. As the Death Eaters grew in number and organization, their master began to move beyond simple terror and into the realm of institutional corruption. The Ministry of Magic, for all its bureaucracy and regulations, was vulnerable. It was staffed by witches and wizards who believed in the rule of law, who trusted in the system. But Voldemort knew that the system could be hollowed out from within. He had already begun this process during his years at Hogwarts, charming professors and manipulating memories. Now, with an army of loyal followers, he could infiltrate the very heart of magical government. High-ranking pure-blood sympathizers, many of whom had never taken the Dark Mark themselves, began to rise through the Ministry's ranks. They were not Death Eaters in the full sense, but they were useful. They passed information, blocked investigations, and ensured that the whispers of a growing dark force were dismissed as paranoia. Men like Lucius Malfoy, who had inherited immense wealth and influence, used their positions to protect their master's interests. The Ministry became a sieve, leaking secrets to Voldemort while its leaders remained oblivious, debating the proper classification of cursed artifacts. But the Death Eaters were not merely spies and saboteurs, they were becoming soldiers. Voldemort personally trained his inner circle in the dark arts, pushing them beyond the boundaries of what most wizards considered possible. He taught them to cast the Unforgivable Curses without hesitation, to create fire that could not be extinguished, to summon shadows that could choke the life from a victim, and in return, they worshipped him. The cult of personality grew stronger with every successful raid, every murdered Muggle-born, every terrified headline in the Daily Prophet. The Knights of Walpurgis had been a meeting of equals, or at least a meeting of peers. The Death Eaters were something else entirely. They were disciples, bound by ritual and fear, their identities subsumed into their master's vision. Each one of them had given themselves over to Lord Voldemort, and in doing so, they had become part of something monstrous. As the decade of the 1970s dawned, the first signs of open war began to appear. Disappearances became too frequent to ignore. Bodies were found in alleys, marked with the dark mark floating green over the night sky. The Ministry at last began to realize that the threat was not a rumor but a reality. But by then it was almost too late. Voldemort's Death Eaters were already embedded in every layer of society, and the reign of terror that would become known as the First Wizarding War was about to begin. That war, with its secret battles and its public horrors, its betrayals and its heroes, would carve the next chapter into the dark history of the magical world, and soon the very name Lord Voldemort would be spoken only in whispers. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The Death Eaters had been born, branded, and bound to their master's will. But a cult of personality, no matter how fanatical, does not become a reign of terror overnight. It requires a catalyst, a moment when fear ceases to be a whispered rumor and becomes the very air that a society breathes. That moment came in the early 1970s, and it transformed the wizarding world of Britain into a landscape of shadows and suspicion. The first signs were subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. A ministry official would fail to return home from work. A shopkeeper would close up for the evening and simply vanish from the face of the earth. At first, these were treated as isolated tragedies, unfortunate but not unheard of in a world where magical accidents could happen. But then the disappearances began to accelerate, and a pattern emerged that chilled the blood of even the most seasoned Aurors. The victims were almost always Muggle-born witches and wizards, or those who openly sympathized with them. They were the people who worked in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, who campaigned for creature rights, who wrote editorials in the Daily Prophet, arguing for integration with the non-magical world. One by one they were being erased, and then came the excuses. The Imperious Curse, one of the 3 unforgivable curses, had always been a terrifying tool, but during this era it became a shield. When a Death Eater was caught in the act of torture or murder, they would simply claim they had been acting under the Imperious Curse. The Ministry, overwhelmed and desperate for any explanation that did not point to a coordinated insurgency, often accepted this defense. The result was a complete breakdown of trust. You could no longer be certain that your neighbor, your colleague, or even your own family member was acting of their own free will. The paranoia was total. People stopped inviting friends over for dinner, afraid that a guest might be a puppet for a hidden master. The streets of Diagon Alley, once bustling with laughter and the clatter of cauldrons, grew quiet after sunset. The glow from the windows of the leaky cauldron seemed dimmer, as if the pub itself was holding its breath. This was the First Wizarding War, and it was not a war of open battles or declared fronts. It was a war of whispers, of shadows that moved in the corners of your vision, of friends who became strangers overnight. The Death Eaters did not seek to conquer territory in the traditional sense. They sought to conquer the human spirit, to break it so thoroughly that resistance would seem not just futile, but unimaginable. They targeted the very institutions that held magical society together. They murdered the families of Aurors. They cursed the children of ministry bureaucrats. They made it clear that there was no safe place, no neutral ground. You were either with them, or you were a target. In the face of this creeping darkness, the Ministry of Magic made a decision that would haunt its legacy for decades. They authorized the use of the Unforgivable Curses by Aurors in the field. This was an act of profound desperation. The same curses that had been classified as unforgivable in 1717, the same spells that represented the absolute boundary between lawful magic and criminal depravity, were now being handed to law enforcement as tools of war. The Cruciatus Curse, the Imperious Curse, even the Killing Curse itself, were now legal weapons in the hands of the state. The logic was simple. To fight monsters, you must be willing to become a monster yourself. But the cost of that logic was immense. It blurred the line between the hunters and the hunted, and it left scars on the souls of those who wielded such power. Many Aurors never recovered from what they were asked to do. Some resigned in disgust. Others embraced the darkness too completely, and the ministry found itself policing its own soldiers. It was into this broken world that a small, desperate resistance was born. It did not emerge from the ministry, which was too compromised by fear and bureaucracy to act decisively. It did not emerge from the halls of Hogwarts, which remained a fragile sanctuary, but could not project power beyond its walls. It emerged from the quiet determination of a few individuals who refused to accept that the world had to end this way. They called themselves the Order of the Phoenix. The original order was a secret society in the truest sense. Its members came from all walks of magical life. There were Aurors who had left the ministry in disgust, like Alastor Moody, whose paranoia would later become legendary, but was, in those days, a perfectly rational response to the world around him. There were Hogwarts professors who risked their careers and their lives to pass information and protect students. There were shopkeepers, healers, and even former Death Eaters who had seen the truth and turned against their master. And at the centre of it all was Albus Dumbledore, the only wizard that Voldemort had ever feared. Dumbledore did not lead the Order from a grand headquarters. He led it from the shadows, using his network of contacts, his unparalleled knowledge of magic, and his willingness to make sacrifices that would have broken a lesser man. The Order of the Phoenix was not an army. It was a family bound by a shared purpose, and its members paid for that bond in blood. They fought skirmishes in the alleys of Nocturne Alley. They protected Muggle-born families who were being hunted. They intercepted cursed objects before they could reach their targets. They were the thin line between civilization and chaos, and they knew that they were losing. The Death Eaters had numbers. They had the element of terror, and they had a leader who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The Order had only each other, and the stubborn belief that the world was worth saving. The war dragged on for years, a grinding attrition of hope and horror. The faces of the fallen became a grim roll call of the bravest and the best. The Pruitt brothers, Gideon and Fabian, died fighting off 5 Death Eaters at once, their bodies so riddled with curses that they were barely recognisable. The McKinnons were slaughtered in their home, a family wiped out in a single night. Each loss was a wound that the Order could not afford, but they could not stop. To stop was to admit that Voldemort had already won. And then, in the midst of this endless night, a prophecy was made. A prophecy that would change everything. It spoke of a child born as the 7th month died, a child with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord. It was a whisper of hope, in a world that had almost forgotten what hope felt like. But prophecies are dangerous things. They do not just predict the future, they shape it. They draw the attention of those who would seek to control them. And when Lord Voldemort heard of this prophecy, he set in motion a chain of events that would lead him to a cottage in Godric's Hollow, and to a family named Potter. The story of that night, the prophecy, and the tragedy that followed is the story of how the First Wizarding War finally ended, and how the seeds of the Second War were sown. It is a story of love and sacrifice, of betrayal and choice, and it begins with a secret that was kept hidden for over a decade. But that is a tale for the next chapter. The First Wizarding War had become a grinding, exhausting conflict. The Order of the Phoenix fought in shadows, striking at Death Eater operations, protecting families, and trying to stem the tide of terror that had gripped magical Britain. But they were losing. Voldemort's network was too deep, his followers too fanatical, and his own power too vast for any conventional resistance to break. The ministry was compromised, its officials either bribed, imperused, or too frightened to act, and the Order, for all its bravery, was a small band of volunteers against an army of the damned. But Voldemort, for all his brilliance, had a blind spot. He believed in destiny as a tool, not as a force beyond his control. He had heard whispers of a prophecy, a fragment of foreknowledge that spoke of a child born at the end of July, a child with the power to vanquish him. This was not a rumour he could ignore. Prophecies were dangerous things, slippery and self-fulfilling. And the idea that some unknown infant could threaten his immortality was an intolerable thought. He needed to know the full text, the exact wording, and the identity of the child. And so, he turned to the one place where such knowledge was stored, the Hall of Prophecy in the Department of Mysteries. But the Ministry, even in its weakened state, had placed powerful enchantments around that chamber. Only those directly mentioned in a prophecy could retrieve it from its shelf. Voldemort could not simply walk in and take the orb. He needed to know who the prophecy was about. He needed a spy, a traitor, someone inside the Order who could feed him the names. That traitor was already in place, hidden in plain sight, a rat among the brave. The prophecy itself was spoken on a cold winter's day in the Hog's Head Inn, a dingy pub in Hogsmeade that attracted a rough crowd. The seer was Sybil Trelawney, a woman whose lineage was steeped in the inner eye, but whose own abilities were erratic, often dismissed as theatrical nonsense. She was interviewing for the divination post at Hogwarts, a position that Albus Dumbledore, out of a sense of old obligation, was reluctantly considering filling. The interview was not going well. Trelawney had been rambling, making vague predictions, and Dumbledore was about to end the meeting politely. And then something shifted. Her eyes went blank, her voice dropped, and she spoke not as Sybil Trelawney, but as a vessel for something ancient and terrible. She uttered the words that would seal the fate of two families and ignite the final phase of the war. She spoke of the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord, born to those who had thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies, and she named the Dark Lord himself as the one who would mark him as his equal. Dumbledore, stunned, heard every word, understood immediately the gravity of what had just been spoken, but he also knew that the prophecy had been overheard. A barman, a young man with a pale, pointed face and a shifty demeanour, had been listening from behind the counter. That barman was Aberforth Dumbledore, Albus's brother, but more importantly, he was not alone. In the shadows of the pub, a spy for Voldemort had been lurking, a Death Eater named Severus Snape, who had been sent to monitor any unusual activity. Snape heard only the first half of the prophecy before being discovered and thrown out. But it was enough. He carried the fragment back to his master. A child born at the end of July, born to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times. That narrowed the field dramatically. There were only 2 families who fit that description. The Longbottoms and the Potters. Both had been relentless thorns in Voldemort's side. Frank and Alice Longbottom were celebrated aurors, brave and skilled, who had personally thwarted several of his plans. James and Lily Potter were young, but they had survived multiple encounters with Death Eaters, and had even faced Voldemort himself and lived to tell the tale. Both couples had infant sons, both born in late July. Harry Potter was born on the 31st, Neville Longbottom on the 30th. Voldemort, in his arrogance, made a choice. He saw himself in Harry Potter, a half-blood like himself, a child born to a Muggle-born mother, a stain he despised, but also a child of a pure-blood father, a lineage he could respect. Neville, by contrast, was pure blood on both sides, a child of the old families, and Voldemort could not imagine that such a child could ever truly oppose him. He chose Harry. He marked him as the one. And so, the hunt began. Voldemort needed to know where the Potters were hiding. The Order had placed them under the Fidelius charm, a spell so powerful that the secret of their location could only be revealed by a chosen secret keeper. The Potters had chosen their closest friend, Sirius Black, to be that keeper. But Sirius, ever the strategist, suggested a decoy. He argued that Voldemort would expect him to be the keeper, so they should switch. Use someone unexpected, someone who would never be suspected. The choice fell on Peter Pettigrew. Peter was a rat in more ways than one. He was small, timid, and desperate to be part of the inner circle. He had been a friend, a member of the Marauders, but he was also weak. And weakness in the face of Voldemort's power was a fatal flaw. Voldemort's agents approached him, offered him a place, promised him rewards. And Peter, terrified and ambitious, betrayed them all. He became the secret keeper, and then he handed the secret to Voldemort. The collapse of the Order's internal security was total. The moment Peter turned, the entire network of safe houses, coded messages, and trusted allies became suspect. No one could be trusted. The war, which had been a stalemate, suddenly tilted decisively in Voldemort's favour. He now knew exactly where to strike. The night of October 31st, 1981, was cold and clear in Godric's Hollow. The village was quiet, a picturesque settlement of cottages and cobblestones. But inside one house, a family was living under a shadow. James Potter was on edge, his wand never far from his hand. Lily was watching over their son, Harry, a baby with his mother's green eyes and his father's untidy black hair. They knew the danger was real, but they believed in the Fidelius. They believed in their friend. They were wrong. The door was blasted open with a force that shook the entire street. Voldemort entered, his red eyes gleaming in the dark, his wand raised. James Potter rushed forward, unarmed, trying to buy time, trying to protect his family. He was cut down instantly, a flash of green light, and he fell. Voldemort stepped over his body and climbed the stairs. Lily heard the commotion. She knew what was coming. She placed Harry in his crib, turned to face the door, and begged. She pleaded with Voldemort to take her instead, to spare her son. She offered her own life, a sacrifice born of pure, unconditional love. Voldemort, who understood nothing of love, who saw it as a weakness, told her to stand aside. She refused. She stood in front of the crib, her arms spread wide, a shield of flesh and bone. He killed her, and then he turned to the baby. He raised his wand, spoke the words, the killing curse, the same spell that had never failed, the same spell that had ended countless lives. The green light erupted from his wand, struck Harry Potter in the face. And then something impossible happened. The curse rebounded. It shattered against the ancient magic that Lily had unknowingly invoked, the sacrificial protection, the oldest and most powerful form of defense. Her blood, her willing death, had created a barrier that Voldemort could not breach. The curse hit him instead. His body was destroyed, torn apart, his soul ripped from its vessel and sent fleeing into the wilderness. He was not dead, not truly, but he was reduced to a wraith, a shadow, a thing of pure desperation. And Harry Potter, the boy who lived, survived with only a scar on his forehead. The war ended that night, not with a battle, but with a miracle. The Death Eaters scattered, their master gone. The Ministry scrambled to make sense of what had happened, and the Order, battered and grieving, began the long, painful process of picking up the pieces. But the victory was fragile. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but it was not over. The Dark Lord was not gone. He was waiting, hiding, biding his time. And in the shadows, a rat named Peter Pettigrew escaped. His betrayal unknown to all but a few. He would wait, too, for the next chapter of this dark history. The Long Interregnum, the years of silence and false peace, when the wizarding world tried to forget, and the seeds of the Second War were quietly sown. The night of the Potter tragedy did not end with a single flash of green light. When the rubble settled and the screams faded, the wizarding world held its breath, waiting for the silence to break into something worse. But the silence held. Voldemort was gone, scattered by his own rebounding curse, and his followers. The Death Eaters, who had terrorized Britain for a decade, found themselves suddenly masterless, exposed and hunted. The war was over, but the hunt was just beginning. In the months that followed, the Ministry of Magic launched a massive manhunt. Aurors swept through homes, interrogated suspects, and raided safe houses. The streets of Diagon Alley, once thick with whispered fear, began to breathe again. But there was no true peace, only the hollow echo of a war that had ended too suddenly to feel real. The decade that followed would come to be known as the Long Interregnum, a false peace built on the fragile assumption that the shadow had been lifted for good. The remaining Death Eaters were rounded up one by one. Some, like Lucius Malfoy, claimed the Imperious Curse had controlled them. They paid their way out with gold and influence, their robes still smelling of the Dark Lord's favour. But others, those who had revelled in the violence, who had tortured for pleasure and killed without remorse, faced the full weight of the Wizengamot. Among them were Bellatrix Lestrange, her husband Rodolphus, his brother Rabastan, and the loyal, silent Barty Crouch Jr. They were cornered not in a duel of wands, but in the aftermath of one final atrocity, a crime so brutal it would become the last great scar of the First Wizarding War. The victims were Frank and Alice Longbottom, both respected Aurors, both members of the original Order of the Phoenix. They were not targeted for information. Voldemort had already fallen. They were targeted for defiance. The Lestranges, driven by a fanaticism that bordered on madness, believed that the Dark Lord's cause would rise again if only they could extract the secret of his defeat. They cornered the Longbottoms in their own home, used the Cruciatus Curse until Frank and Alice could no longer scream. The torture lasted hours. When the Aurors arrived, they found two bodies that were still alive, but whose minds had been shattered beyond repair. Frank and Alice Longbottom never recovered. They were committed to St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries, where they would spend the rest of their lifetimes in a haze of catatonic confusion, unaware of their son Neville, who grew up in the shadow of their stolen minds. The trial of the Lestranges was swift and severe. The Wizengamot, still reeling from the war, sentenced them to life in Azkaban. Bellatrix Lestrange screamed defiance as the Dementors took her. She was proud of what she had done. For the wizarding world, the Longbottom tragedy became a symbol of the war's true cost. The false peace that followed was built not on justice, but on exhausted relief. People wanted to forget. They wanted to believe that Voldemort was gone, that the Death Eaters were locked away, that the darkness had been contained, and so they did. They celebrated, they rebuilt, they returned to their lives. The Ministry grew complacent. The Order of the Phoenix disbanded, and in the shadows of Albania, a mere shadow and vapour lingered. Voldemort had not died. His Horcruxes had tethered his soul to the earth, and what remained of him was a broken, ghost-like creature, barely more than a wisp of smoke and desperation. He fled to the forests of Albania, where he possessed small animals, rats, snakes, and waited. He existed without a body, without power, without followers. The once great Dark Lord was reduced to a parasite, clinging to existence inside the hollow trunk of a tree, watching the world move on without him. The Long Interregnum was a time of forgetting. But in that forgotten corner of Europe, the ember of the old darkness still glowed, waiting for a spark. That spark would come, years later, from a timid professor and a curious boy. And when it did, the false peace would shatter, and the world would learn that the Long Interregnum had never been an end, only a pause. The story of that return, and the second war it ignited, is the story of the return of the Dark Lord. For a decade, the wizarding world had convinced itself that the nightmare was over. The Long Interregnum, that strange hollow period between wars, had lulled the Ministry into a comfortable denial. They had rounded up the most obvious Death Eaters, the ones who had been caught in the open when the Dark Lord fell. The Lestranges, the Crouch Son, a handful of others were sent to Azkaban. But the deeper rot, the network of sympathizers, and the quietly waiting faithful had simply burrowed deeper underground. They waited, they watched, and they knew, with a certainty that the Ministry could never understand, that their master was not truly gone. But for the Ministry, The absence of open terror was enough. They declared victory. They rebuilt the facade of order, and they dismissed the whispered warnings of Albus Dumbledore as the paranoia of an old man who could not let go of a war that had already been won. This was the world into which Harry Potter was thrust. A boy who had become a symbol without ever asking for the role. And it was this world, this fragile, willful ignorance, that Lord Voldemort was about to shatter forever. The instrument of that shattering would be the Triwizard Tournament, a grand ancient tradition meant to foster international magical cooperation. It was a spectacle of champions and dragons, of mermaids and mazes, but beneath the glittering surface, it was a stage, and the script had been written by the most loyal servant the Dark Lord had ever commanded, a man who had been living under the Imperious Curse for years, waiting for his moment. That man was Barty Crouch Jr., escaped from Azkaban, hidden under his father's own roof, and now disguised as the new defense against the dark arts professor, Alastor Moody. Every step of the tournament was manipulated. The selection of the champions was rigged to ensure Harry's name emerged from the Goblet of Fire. The tasks were designed to test him, to push him, but never to truly harm him, not yet. The goal was not to kill the boy in the maze. The goal was to bring him, alive and unsuspecting, to the one place where the Dark Lord could finish what he had started. The third task, a vast hedge maze filled with magical obstacles, was the final corridor, and at its heart, the Triwizard Cup had been transformed into a portkey. When Harry and Cedric Diggory touched the cup together, the world twisted. They were ripped from the Hogwarts grounds and deposited in a cold, overgrown graveyard. The air was thick with decay and the smell of damp earth. The name of the place was Little Hangleton, and it was the ancestral home of the Riddle family, the very family Tom Riddle had murdered to begin his journey toward immortality. It was a place of death, and it was here that death would be summoned again. Cedric was killed instantly. A flash of green light and he was gone. Harry was bound to a headstone, helpless as the scene unfolded around him. And then the ritual began. It was the oldest and most terrible magic, the ritual of bone, flesh and blood. From the grave of Tom Riddle Sr., a single bone was drawn. It rose from the earth, a pale fragment of the father who had abandoned his son. That was the bone, unknowingly given, but willingly taken. Then, from the hand of the servant, Peter Pettigrew, a slice of flesh was cut. Pettigrew, the rat, the traitor, the man who had betrayed James and Lily Potter, now offered his own hand as the second ingredient. The flesh of the servant, freely given to rebuild the master. And finally, the blood of the enemy, Harry's blood. The blood of the one person the Dark Lord had marked as his equal, the one he had failed to kill as a child. Pettigrew sliced Harry's arm, and the dark red drops fell into the cauldron. The blood of the enemy, forcibly taken to complete the bond. The cauldron erupted. A white-hot vapor rose, and from within it a figure emerged. It was not the grotesque, infantile creature that had haunted the forests of Albania. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with red eyes and a face that was more serpent than human. Lord Voldemort had returned. He rose from the cauldron, stepped onto the grass of the graveyard, and the Death Eaters, those who had been summoned by the dark mark burning on their arms, began to apparate into the circle. They knelt. They kissed the hem of his robes. They wept with joy, and the Dark Lord looked upon them with cold satisfaction. He had returned. The Interregnum was over, but the Ministry of Magic refused to believe it. When Harry escaped, clutching Cedric's body, and told the world what had happened, the response was not shock, but denial. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, could not accept that the greatest threat of the century had returned on his watch. It was easier to believe that Harry Potter was delusional, that Dumbledore was plotting a coup, that the entire story was a fabrication designed to destabilize the government. And so the smear campaign began. The Daily Prophet, the Ministry's mouthpiece, turned on Harry and Dumbledore. They painted the boy as a disturbed attention seeker, a liar, a boy who had somehow caused Cedric's death himself. They called Dumbledore a senile old man, a schemer who had lost his grip on reality. The Ministry's denial was not passive, it was aggressive, it was a weapon. They sent Dolores Umbridge to Hogwarts to seize control, to silence dissent, to rewrite the curriculum so that students would never learn how to defend themselves against the very magic that was now returning to the world. The wizarding world was being prepared for war, but not the war it needed. It was being prepared for a war of propaganda, of denial, of fear. The Dark Lord was rebuilding his forces in the shadows, and the Ministry was handing him the tools of victory by blinding the very people who should have been standing against him. And that is where the next chapter of this dark history begins. The Ministry would fall, not from a direct assault, but from within. The infiltration of the very heart of magical government was about to begin, and the name of that chapter is the Second Wizarding War. Infiltration. The previous chapter ended with Voldemort reborn in the graveyard at Little Hangleton. His Death Eaters summoned, the dark mark burning once more over the skies of Britain. But that night was not the beginning of the war. It was a signal, a declaration that the nightmare had returned. The Ministry of Magic, however, refused to believe it. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister for Magic, had spent the last decade convincing himself that Voldemort was gone forever, that the whispers of his return were the delusions of an old man and a traumatized boy. And so, when Harry Potter emerged from the Triwizard Maze clutching Cedric Diggory's body, when he screamed that Voldemort was back, the Ministry did not rally. They buried the truth. The summer of 1995 became a season of silence and denial. Harry Potter was branded a liar, an attention seeker, a boy broken by grief. The Daily Prophet ran articles questioning his sanity. Dolores Umbridge was installed at Hogwarts as the defense against the dark arts teacher, but her real mission was to suppress any talk of the Dark Lord's return. She was a pink-clad sentinel of the Ministry's cowardice, and she made the school a prison of paperwork and propaganda. But while the Ministry hid behind parchment and quills, Voldemort was not idle. He was rebuilding his army, gathering the giants, the werewolves, the Dementors, and the Death Eaters, who had slipped through the cracks of the First War. He was patient. He was waiting. The war did not begin with a declaration. It began with a theft. In the summer of 1996, Voldemort learned of a prophecy held in the Department of Mysteries, a prophecy that foretold the only way he could be defeated. It was a record of Sybil Trelawney's words, the same prophecy that had set him on the path to murder the Potters. He wanted it destroyed, but he could not enter the Ministry himself, so he used the weapon he had planted years ago, a connection to Harry Potter's mind, a thin, fragile thread that he could pull and twist. Harry began to see visions. He saw a door, a hallway, a room full of shelves lined with glass orbs. He saw Voldemort's thoughts, his desires, his rage. Dumbledore, fearing the trap, tried to keep Harry occupied with lessons in occlumency, the art of closing the mind. But the visions grew stronger, more insistent. And then on the night of the June, Harry saw Sirius Black, his godfather, being tortured in the very room he had seen in his dreams. He could not wait. He could not trust Dumbledore to act in time. He took his friends, Ron and Hermione, and together they flew to London on the backs of Thestrals, invisible horses that only those who had seen death could see. The Department of Mysteries was a labyrinth of secrets. There was the Room of Time, where clocks ticked backward and hourglasses held the hours of lives yet to be lived. There was the Room of Space, where planets floated in jars and doors opened onto endless voids. There was the Room of Death, where a stone archway stood, its tattered veil whispering with the voices of the departed. And there was the Hall of Prophecy, row after row of dusty orbs, each one a frozen moment of fate. Harry found the prophecy with his name on it, but before he could take it, it snapped shut. Death Eaters emerged from the shadows. Lucius Malfoy, Bellatrix Lestrange, and a dozen others, their masks gleaming in the dim light. They had been waiting. They had used Harry's love for Sirius, his desperate need to save his godfather, to lure him here. The battle that followed was chaos, A storm of spells and shattered glass and screaming, the Order of the Phoenix arrived, summoned by Dumbledore's secret network, and the Ministry atrium became a war zone. Sirius fought Bellatrix, his laughter wild and free, until she struck him with a curse that sent him tumbling through the veil in the room of death. He was gone. He did not fall. He simply passed through the fabric of existence, and Harry's world collapsed. But in that moment of despair, Voldemort himself appeared. He had come to finish the prophecy, to kill Harry, to silence the only threat to his immortality. He stood in the atrium, his red eyes blazing, his wand raised, and he duelled Dumbledore in a battle that shattered fountains and melted stone. The two greatest wizards of the age, locked in combat, their spells weaving through the air like serpents of light. And then, the Ministry officials arrived. They saw Voldemort with their own eyes. They saw the dark mark, the snake-like face, the unmistakable presence of the most feared wizard in history. Cornelius Fudge stood frozen, his denial crumbling into dust. The truth was no longer a rumour. It was a fact, burned into the marble floor of the Ministry of Magic. Voldemort fled, but the damage was done. The war was now public. The Ministry had no choice but to acknowledge the return, to mobilise, to prepare, but they were too late. The summer of 1996 became a summer of fear. People disappeared. Muggle killings rose. The Dementors abandoned Azkaban to join Voldemort's army. The prison became a fortress of the Dark Lord's allies. The Order of the Phoenix regrouped, but they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and Dumbledore, the only wizard Voldemort ever feared, was growing old. The next year, 1997, was the year of the fall. Dumbledore had been hunting Horcruxes, the fragments of Voldemort's soul that kept him tethered to life. He had destroyed one, a ring that had cursed his hand, leaving him with only a year to live. He knew his time was short. He knew that Voldemort had set Draco Malfoy a task, a mission to murder him, to prove his loyalty to the Dark Lord, and Dumbledore, in his wisdom, chose to control his own death. He planned it with Severus Snape, the man who had been his spy for nearly 2 decades. He asked Snape to kill him, to spare Draco's soul, to preserve Snape's position as a double agent. The night came. The Death Eaters infiltrated Hogwarts through the vanishing cabinet in the Room of Requirement. Draco cornered Dumbledore on the astronomy tower, his wand shaking, his courage failing. But before he could act, Snape arrived. He raised his wand, and he spoke the words that would echo through history. Avada Kedavra. The green light struck Dumbledore in the chest, and he fell from the tower, his body tumbling through the night air, landing broken on the grounds below. The greatest wizard of the age was dead. The only wizard Voldemort ever feared was gone. The school erupted in chaos. The Death Eaters fled, but the damage was done. The Ministry, already weakened, fell into panic, and Voldemort, now free of his greatest obstacle, moved to take control. He did not storm the Ministry with an army. He did not need to. He infiltrated it. He placed his followers in key positions, used the Imperious Curse on officials, and slowly, silently, the government became his puppet. By the summer of 1997, the Ministry of Magic was no longer a force for order. It was a tool of the Dark Lord. The Muggle-born Registration Commission was established, a bureaucratic mask for genocide. Muggle-born witches and wizards were accused of stealing magic from pure bloods, of being frauds, of having no right to their wands. They were rounded up, their wands snapped, their memories wiped, and they were sent to Azkaban, or worse. The Ministry became a machine of persecution, and the wizarding world learned a terrible truth. Evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a badge. The war was no longer a secret. It was a reality, a daily horror of disappearances and interrogations and fear. Hogwarts was no longer safe. The Order was scattered, and Harry, Ron, and Hermione were on the run, hunting Horcruxes, trying to find a way to destroy the fragments of Voldemort's soul before the Dark Lord could become truly immortal. The year that followed would be known as the Year of Darkness, a time when hope seemed lost, and the only light came from the courage of a few who refused to surrender. The death of Albus Dumbledore was not merely the loss of the most powerful wizard of the age. It was the severing of the last great anchor of hope in the wizarding world. For years, he had been the immovable object against which Voldemort's tide had crashed and broken. With him gone, the floodgates opened. The Ministry of Magic, already riddled with corruption and denial, fell within weeks. The death of the minister himself, Rufus Scrimgeour, was a brutal punctuation mark on the end of any pretense of resistance from the established order, and into that vacuum stepped the Death Eaters, not as raiders or terrorists, but as governors. The year that followed was not a war of open battles, but a long, suffocating occupation. It was the year of darkness. Hogwarts' school of witchcraft and wizardry, the ancient fortress of learning and sanctuary, became the crown jewel of this occupation. Voldemort understood symbolism better than most gave him credit for. He knew that to control Hogwarts was to control the very soul of magical Britain, and so he appointed two of his most loyal and most vicious servants to oversee the school, Alecto and Amicus Carrow. The Carrow siblings were not subtle wizards. They were instruments of pure, sadistic enforcement. Alecto taught Muggle studies, but her curriculum was not about understanding non-magical people. It was a propaganda course, a relentless indoctrination of hatred, teaching students that Muggles were subhuman, vermin to be crushed. Amicus taught defense against the dark arts, a bitter irony, as the subject was now renamed simply the Dark Arts, and students were forced to practice the Cruciatus Curse on those who had been detained for questioning. The castle that had once been a home became a prison. The hallways echoed with the sound of punishment. Students were subjected to torture for minor infractions. The prefects, those who had once maintained order with badges and gentle authority, were replaced by the inquisitorial squad, a gang of bullies given free rein to enforce the new regime. Filch, the caretaker, was in his element, given permission to use the chains and manacles he had always dreamed of. The very stones of Hogwarts seemed to weep. But even as the school fell into shadow, a different kind of war was being fought in the wilderness. Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger were not at Hogwarts. They were out there, in the cold, in the forests, in the abandoned houses, hunting ghosts. Dumbledore had left them a task, a burden so immense that it seemed impossible. Find and destroy the Horcruxes. These were the fragments of Voldemort's soul, the anchors that kept him tethered to life. As long as even one remained, the Dark Lord could not be truly killed. The trio had no army, no headquarters, no backup. They had only a locket, a cup, a diadem, a snake, and a diary that was already ash. They had a sword that could absorb basilisk venom. And they had each other. Their journey was a slow, grinding descent into desperation. They moved from place to place, always hunted, always hungry. The locket Horcrux they carried with them for months, a malevolent weight that poisoned their minds and turned their friendship into a razor's edge of resentment and paranoia. Ron left them for a time, broken by the locket's influence, but he returned, and in returning, he proved that the bond between them was stronger than any dark magic. They destroyed the locket with the sword of Gryffindor, a moment of triumph that felt like a single candle lit in an abyss. But the hunt was far from over. They broke into Gringotts, the most secure vault in the wizarding world. To steal the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, they rode a dragon into the sky, a spectacular escape that announced to the world that Harry Potter was still alive and fighting. And in that act, they sent a signal. The resistance, which had been scattered and silent, began to stir. In the shadows of the occupied ministry, in the safe houses of the Order, in the homes of those who refused to bow, a new hope flickered, and that hope had a voice. It came through the airwaves, a clandestine radio program called Potter Watch. It was the last flickering light of magical resistance, a broadcast that defied the ministry's propaganda, hosted by figures using code names like River, Rodent, and Royal. It was a lifeline. It reported the truth, which Death Eaters had fallen, which resistance cells were active, and most importantly, that Harry Potter was still out there, still hunting. For those listening in the dead of night, huddled under silencing charms, the voice of Potterwatch was a reminder that they were not alone. It was the sound of defiance. The hunt for the Horcruxes became a systematic dismantling of Voldemort's immortality. Piece by piece, the Dark Lord's soul was being stripped away. He did not feel it at first, so blinded by his own arrogance. He believed that his Horcruxes were hidden beyond reach, that no one could possibly find them all. But he was wrong. The diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw was destroyed in the Room of Requirement, a place of secrets that could not keep this one. Nagini, his loyal serpent and final Horcrux, was marked for death. The noose was tightening, and Voldemort, for all his power, could not see it. He was too busy consolidating his rule, too busy torturing the captured, too busy preparing for what he thought would be his final victory. He summoned his forces to Hogwarts. He demanded that Harry Potter be handed over. He did not realize that he was walking into a trap of his own making. The Year of Darkness was about to end, not with a whimper, but with a roar. The final stand was coming, and it would be fought on the grounds of the school that had been defiled. The Battle of Hogwarts was about to begin. The previous chapter took us through the Year of Darkness at Hogwarts, when the Carrow siblings turned the ancient castle into a place of fear and punishment. But that darkness was only the prelude to something far more terrible. Something that had been building since the moment Tom Riddle first set foot in the school as a boy. The hunt for the Horcruxes had been a desperate race against time. And by the spring of 1998, the final pieces were falling into place. Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger had destroyed most of Voldemort's anchors to immortality. But the most dangerous one remained hidden somewhere within the very walls of Hogwarts itself. The news that Voldemort knew they were hunting his Horcruxes spread like wildfire through the Death Eater ranks. The Dark Lord understood that his immortality was compromised, and that knowledge drove him to a fury unlike anything his followers had ever witnessed. He gathered his forces, summoning every Death Eater, every giant, every Dementor, and every dark creature that owed him allegiance. The final stand was coming, and it would be fought on the grounds of the school that had once been the safest place in the wizarding world. Harry, Ron, and Hermione arrived in Hogsmeade under cover of darkness, guided by the loyal Aberforth Dumbledore. They entered the castle through the secret passage behind the portrait of Ariana Dumbledore, and what they found inside was a school transformed. The students had been living under a regime of terror, forced to practice the Cruciatus Curse on those who disobeyed. But the spark of rebellion had never been fully extinguished. Neville Longbottom had been leading a resistance from the shadows, and when Harry revealed himself, the castle erupted, with a hope that had been dormant for nearly a year. But hope alone could not stop what was coming. Voldemort knew Harry was at Hogwarts, and he would not allow his greatest enemy to escape again. The Death Eaters marched on the castle in numbers that seemed impossible. Hundreds of dark wizards, giants with feet that shook the earth, dementors that drained warmth from the air, and spiders of monstrous size all converged on the ancient fortress. The defenders of Hogwarts knew they were outnumbered, but they also knew that this was the moment they had been preparing for. The final stand that would determine the fate of the magical world. Professor McGonagall, who had been forced to play the role of a compromised headmistress under the Carrows, threw off the mask of compliance the moment Harry appeared. She rallied the teachers, the Order of the Phoenix, and every student old enough to hold a wand. The castle itself became a weapon, its statues and suits of armour springing to life under her command. The walls were reinforced with enchantments, the staircases were repositioned to confuse invaders, and every corridor became a potential battlefield. The battle began with a thunderous crash as the Death Eaters breached the outer defences. Spells flew through the air like streaks of coloured lightning, and the night sky was lit with explosions of magic. The defenders fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that there would be no second chances. Fred Weasley fell in the chaos, his laughter silenced forever, and the loss sent a shockwave of grief through the Weasley family. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks died side by side, leaving behind an orphaned son who would never know the bravery of his parents. The cost of victory was being paid in blood, and the battle was far from over. In the midst of the carnage, Harry slipped away. He had a mission that transcended the battle itself, a task that required him to find the final Horcrux hidden somewhere in the castle, guided by the memories of Voldemort's past. He made his way to the Room of Requirement, where the diadem of Ravenclaw had been concealed for decades. There he faced Draco Malfoy, Crabbe and Goyle, but it was not a duel of skill that decided the outcome. Crabbe unleashed Fiendfire, a cursed fire that consumed everything in its path, and in the Inferno, the diadem was destroyed. But the fire also claimed Crabbe himself, a grim reminder that dark magic devours its users as readily as its victims. With the Horcrux destroyed, Harry knew there was only one thing left to do. He had to face Voldemort directly, and he had to do it alone. But before he could walk into the Forbidden Forest to meet his fate, he needed to understand something that had haunted him for years. He needed to understand Severus Snape. The revelation of Severus Snape's true allegiance is one of the most profound moments in the entire dark history of the wizarding world. For years, Harry had believed Snape was a servant of Voldemort, a man who had betrayed Dumbledore and revelled in cruelty. But the truth was far more complex and far more tragic. Snape had been a Death Eater in his youth, drawn to the promise of power and the allure of pure blood ideology. But when Voldemort targeted Lily Potter, the woman Snape had loved since childhood, everything changed. He went to Dumbledore and begged for her protection, and in doing so, he became a spy for the Order of the Phoenix. For 17 years, Snape lived a double life. He served Voldemort while secretly working to undermine him, and he protected Harry from the shadows, even as he tormented him in the classroom. Dumbledore had trusted Snape with the most dangerous secret of all, the knowledge that Harry himself was a Horcrux, a piece of Voldemort's soul that had to be destroyed. Snape was tasked with killing Dumbledore when the time came, not out of malice, but because the old headmaster was already dying and needed to preserve Snape's cover. The Prince's Tale, as it came to be known, was the story of a man who spent his entire life atoning for a single mistake. A man who loved so deeply that he was willing to sacrifice everything, including his own soul, to protect the child of the woman he could never have. When Voldemort ordered Nagini to kill Snape in the Shrieking Shack, the dying man gave Harry his memories. And in those memories, Harry saw the truth. He saw Snape's childhood friendship with Lily, his descent into darkness, his desperate plea for her life, and his long years of service to Dumbledore. He saw that Snape had been protecting him all along, and that the hatred Harry had felt for him was based on a misunderstanding that ran to the very core of the war. Snape's final act was to give Harry the knowledge he needed to defeat Voldemort, and in doing so, he redeemed himself in a way that few wizards ever could. Armed with the truth, Harry walked into the Forbidden Forest alone. He knew that Voldemort would not stop until he was dead, and he knew that the only way to destroy the piece of Voldemort's soul inside him was to let Voldemort kill him. The ultimate sacrifice in the Forbidden Forest was not a defeat, but a victory of a different kind. Harry walked through the trees with the Resurrection Stone in his hand, summoning the spirits of his parents, Sirius Black and Remus Lupin. They walked with him, offering comfort and courage, until he stood face to face with the Dark Lord. Voldemort cast the killing curse, and Harry fell. But the curse did not kill him. Instead, it destroyed the fragment of Voldemort's soul that had been living inside him since that night in Godric's Hollow. Harry found himself in a place that was neither life nor death, a liminal space where he spoke with the spirit of Albus Dumbledore. There, he learned the final piece of the puzzle. The Elder Wand, the most powerful wand in existence, had never truly belonged to Voldemort. Its allegiance had passed from Dumbledore to Draco Malfoy, who had disarmed the old headmaster, and then to Harry, who had taken Malfoy's wand. When Voldemort used the Elder Wand against Harry, the wand refused to harm its true master. The curse rebounded, and Voldemort was destroyed by his own magic. The breaking of the Elder Wand's power was the final act of the war. Harry could have kept the wand, could have become the most powerful wizard in the world, but he understood that the cycle of dark magic could only be broken by choice. He repaired his own wand with the Elder Wand, and then returned it to Dumbledore's tomb, where its power would never be used again. The war was over, but the cost was immeasurable. The Battle of Hogwarts was the final stand of the defenders against the full might of the Death Eaters. And it was won not by overwhelming force, but by sacrifice, love, and the courage to face death without flinching. The revelation of Severus Snape's true allegiance changed everything Harry thought he knew about the war, and the ultimate sacrifice in the Forbidden Forest broke the cycle of violence that had defined the wizarding world for generations. But the story does not end with Voldemort's defeat. The aftermath of the war would bring its own challenges. As the magical world struggled to rebuild from the ashes of destruction, the next chapter, The Aftermath and the Purge, will explore what happened when the fighting stopped and the reckoning began. The Death Eaters were scattered, but the ideology that had fueled them was not so easily destroyed. The Ministry had to be rebuilt, the traitors had to be rooted out, and the wounds of the war had to be healed. And in the midst of that rebuilding, a new generation would have to decide what kind of world they wanted to create. A world that would honour the sacrifices of those who had fallen, or a world that would repeat the mistakes of the past. The Battle of Hogwarts ended not with a surrender, but with a silence. The kind of silence that follows a storm so violent that the world forgets how to make sound. When the last echoes of Voldemort's final scream faded into the dawn, the defenders of Hogwarts stood among the rubble, breathing air that no longer tasted of smoke and terror. But war does not end when the last spell is cast. War ends when the survivors look at each other and realize they must now rebuild a world from the bones of the old one. The Ministry of Magic, that great stone monument to order and control, lay in ruins both literal and figurative. For nearly a year, it had been a puppet state, its corridors walked by Death Eaters in polished robes, its laws written in fear and blood. The moment Voldemort fell, the puppet strings snapped, but the puppets remained. And so began the most delicate and dangerous phase of the post-war era, the Reconstruction. Kingsley Shacklebolt stepped forward as the natural leader. He had been an Auror of extraordinary skill, a member of the Order of the Phoenix, and one of the few who had never bent under the weight of Voldemort's shadow. Now he was appointed acting minister for magic, and later confirmed as the permanent minister. His first task was not to punish, but to restore. The ministry had to function again, not as a weapon of the Dark Lord, but as a shield for the innocent. Kingsley understood that institutions are only as strong as the trust people place in them, and trust had been shattered. One of his earliest and most controversial decisions was the removal of the Dementors from Azkaban. For centuries, those soul-sucking horrors had served as the prison's silent guards, their presence a deterrent so terrifying that few prisoners ever attempted escape. But the Dementors had never been loyal to the Ministry. They had been loyal to despair. Under Voldemort, they had multiplied and grown bold, feasting on the misery of an entire nation. Kingsley knew that a prison guarded by creatures that fed on human suffering could never be part of a just society, so he ordered them stripped of their posts. The Dementors were driven from the island fortress, their cold forms retreating into the mists of the North Sea, no longer welcome in the world they had terrorized. Azkaban itself was reformed, its cells now watched by auras and enchanted wards, not by the kiss of darkness. But the reconstruction of the Ministry was not only about prisons and policies, it was about people, the survivors of the war, the ones who had fought, the ones who had lost, the ones who had hidden in terror for years, needed to see that justice was not just a word. And so the trials began. The surviving Death Eaters were rounded up from the battlefield, and, from the shadows, where they had tried to hide. They were brought before the Wizengamot, not in secret hearings, but in open court. The world needed to see their faces. The world needed to hear their names. Lucius Malfoy, his wealth and influence now worthless, stood in chains. His son had turned against the Dark Lord, but Lucius had spent years serving him, and the stain of that service could not be washed away by one act of reluctant defiance. He was sentenced to life in Azkaban, though his sentence was later commuted due to his cooperation and his family's suffering under Voldemort's rule. It was a mercy that many found hard to swallow. Bellatrix Lestrange, of course, was beyond the reach of any court. She had fallen in battle, her body crumpling as Molly Weasley's curse struck her down, but her legacy remained. The Lestranges had been the most fanatical of Voldemort's followers, and their name became a curse in itself. Other Death Eaters faced similar fates. Fenrir Greyback, the werewolf who had revelled in terrorising children, was captured and sentenced to die. The Carrow siblings, who had turned Hogwarts into a nightmare, received life sentences. And then, there were those who had slipped through the cracks, the ones who had never been caught, the ones who had worn masks and whispered curses in the dark. They would spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, knowing that the world now knew what they were. But the trials were not only about punishment, they were about truth. The Wizengamot heard testimony from survivors, from the families of the fallen, from those who had endured the Cruciatus curse and lived to tell the tale. The pure-blood families who had long claimed superiority found their names dragged through the mud. The Malfoys, the Blacks, the Lestranges, the Greengrasses, the Knots. Their legacies were permanently stained. The ideology of blood purity, which had once been whispered in drawing rooms and shouted in rallies, was now exposed as the lie it had always been. The children of these families would grow up under the weight of their parents' sins, and the name they carried would never be innocent again. And yet the scars of the war were not only on the guilty. The Hogwarts generation, the students who had lived through the Year of Darkness, carried wounds that would never fully heal. They had seen their teachers tortured. They had watched their classmates disappear. They had learned to cast defensive spells before they had learned to dance at a ball. The long-term psychological scars on these young witches and wizards were profound. Some could not sleep without a wand under their pillow. Others flinched at the sound of a door slamming. The war had stolen their childhood, and no amount of victory could give it back. The ministry established programs for mental healing, for counselling, for the kind of care that had been neglected for too long. But the truth was that the wizarding world had never been good at talking about trauma. They had always preferred to bury it, to move on, to pretend that the darkness had been defeated, and that was enough. But the darkness does not leave so easily. It lingers in the corners of the mind, in the nightmares that come unbidden, in the way a survivor might freeze at the sight of a green flash of light. Kingsley Shacklebolt knew this. He had seen too much to believe in easy endings, so he worked to build a ministry that would not only enforce the law, but also protect the vulnerable. He created new departments focused on magical creatures' rights, on the rehabilitation of those who had been imperiused, on the education of a generation that had been taught hatred. It was slow work. It was painful work, but it was necessary. The wizarding world had been given a second chance. The question was whether they would waste it on revenge or use it to build something better. The trials of the Death Eaters were a beginning, not an end. The removal of the Dementors was a statement, not a solution, and the scars on the Hogwarts generation were a reminder that the cost of war is never paid in full on the battlefield. As the ministry rebuilt its halls and the trials concluded their final verdicts, the survivors began to look forward. They planted new trees in the grounds of Hogwarts. They repaired the broken windows of Diagon Alley. They told stories of the fallen, not as martyrs, but as people who had chosen to stand when it would have been easier to kneel. And they waited, as the wizarding world had always waited, for the next shadow to rise. because that is the truth of dark history. It does not end, it cycles. It returns in new forms, with new faces, with new justifications for old cruelties. The reconstruction of the Ministry was a triumph, but it was also a warning. The peace that followed the Battle of Hogwarts was fragile, held together by the will of those who remembered what it cost. And in the quiet moments, when the candles burned low and the night pressed against the windows, even the bravest among them wondered how long it would last. The eternal cycle of the dark arts is not a story with a single ending. It is a story that repeats, that echoes, that whispers in the blood of every generation. And the only way to break it is to remember the faces of the fallen, to remember the weight of the choices made in the dark, to remember that the line between light and shadow is not drawn in stone, but in the hearts of those who choose which path to walk. The next chapter of that story is already waiting, and it will begin the moment we forget. And so, after the trials, after the purges, after the Ministry was rebuilt and the Dementors were driven from Azkaban, the wizarding world faced a question it had never truly answered. The question was not whether Lord Voldemort was gone. He was. His body had perished in the Great Hall, his soul shattered beyond any hope of return. The question was whether the dark arts themselves could ever be truly destroyed, because the history of magic is not a straight line from darkness to light. It is a cycle, an endless turning of the wheel, and the dark arts have always been part of its rotation. The Ministry of Magic, under Kingsley Shacklebolt, moved quickly to restore order. Laws were rewritten. Corrupt officials were removed from their posts. The Auror Office was reformed, and the use of unforgivable curses by anyone other than a properly sanctioned Auror was once again punishable by life in Azkaban. But even as the new administrations scrubbed the stain of Voldemort's influence from the halls of power, the deeper truth remained. The dark arts are not a political movement. They are not a faction that can be defeated in a single war. They are a branch of magical knowledge, as old as wizardkind itself, and knowledge cannot be unmade. Consider the ancient figures we have traced across this history. Herpo the Foul, who lived more than 1,000 years before Hogwarts was founded, did not merely create a single Horcrux. He created the first one. He discovered the principle that a soul could be split, that death could be cheated through the most terrible of sacrifices. And that knowledge did not die with him. It was passed down, hidden in forbidden texts, whispered among those willing to pay the price. Godalot compiled the darkest spells into Magic Mostia Vial, and that book survived the centuries, changing hands, corrupting readers, spreading its poison like a slow curse. Ekrizdis built his fortress on the island that would become Azkaban, and, even after his death, the darkness he summoned lingered there, feeding on the misery of generations. This is the fundamental truth that the Ministry, for all its good intentions, could never fully address. The dark arts are not a creature that can be hunted to extinction. They are a seed that can lie dormant for decades, waiting for the right conditions to grow again. The spells themselves do not fade. The rituals do not lose their power. The knowledge is simply hidden, waiting in the corners of the world, in old libraries and forgotten vaults, in the minds of those who survived the wars and carried their secrets into silence. The lingering artifacts of the dark arts are scattered across the globe, and many of them were never found. The Locket Horcrux was destroyed by Ron Weasley with the Sword of Gryffindor. The cup was stabbed by Hermione Granger in the Chamber of Secrets. The diadem was burned by fiend fire in the Room of Requirement. But what of the other objects? What of the cursed jewelry, the enchanted weapons, the dark tomes that Voldemort's followers created and hid before their master fell? The Ministry conducted raids, of course. They searched the homes of known Death Eaters, confiscated dark artifacts, and locked them away in secure vaults. But the wizarding world is vast, and its shadows are deep. There are objects of immense dark power that remain undiscovered, buried in the ruins of old estates, hidden in the hollows of ancient trees, waiting for someone to find them. And then, There are the Horcruxes that were never made. The knowledge of how to create one is still out there. It is written in books that were never burned, spoken in whispers that were never silenced. The Ministry cannot outlaw a thought. They cannot imprison a memory. And as long as the knowledge exists, there will always be someone willing to use it. The cycle of the dark arts is not broken. It is only paused. This is the thin line that defines the entire history of the wizarding world. The pursuit of power and the loss of humanity are two sides of the same coin, and every generation must choose which side to turn face up. The founders of Hogwarts understood this. They built a school to teach young witches and wizards how to control their magic, how to use it responsibly, how to resist the temptations of the dark arts. But even among the founders, there was Salazar Slytherin, who believed that only the pure-blooded were worthy of that education. He did not see himself as a dark wizard. He saw himself as a protector, a preserver of a sacred lineage. And yet his legacy became the foundation of Voldemort's ideology. The same pattern repeats across the centuries. Grindelwald believed he was building a better world, a world where wizards ruled openly, and muggles were subjugated for their own good. He was charming, intelligent, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. It was only in the final years of his life, locked in his cell at Nurmengard, that he seemed to understand the horror of what he had done, and even then his repentance came too late to undo the damage. Voldemort, for all his monstrousness, was not born a monster. He was Tom Riddle, a boy from an orphanage, abandoned by his father, raised in a world that feared him.